Hello, and welcome to Fiddler's Green podcast number 49.5. Assume a can opener. So, people are probably surprised. Usually, I don't have Fiddler Green podcasts one after the other, especially since I don't have a ton of material to present tonight. But I wanted to talk about one particular thing, not really making a response live stream because I don't do those, but it is kind of a response live stream to a conversation that went on Substack that I wanted to comment on in more detail. And I felt this would be a good medium to go through this in a lecture format. And as always, doing these streams, I am incredibly sleep deprived because of insomnia. So this is going to be a wild ride. Hopefully everyone is hearing me fine on this microphone. People constantly complain that it's either too far away or too close to me. But at any rate, we can get started. Hopefully everyone's having a great Juneteenth. This is actually very appropriately our new national holiday. I don't know if any of the listeners from the Fiddler Green podcast community celebrate Juneteenth, but if you do, welcome. I don't exactly know how to introduce this topic other than to talk about how I have been beefing with a few people on Substack, and I wanted to do a presentation on practical policymaking. I'm talking about practical policymaking, about hypothetically crafting solutions for people in an ideas space and the problems with that or the issues with that in a realistic capacity. And just work through it with you guys and share my own thoughts. And in the meanwhile, maybe address a certain Substacker who I may or may not name directly, who challenged me on some of these issues and who asked for some pushback. But I like to start, I guess, to go into the lecture mode with just a joke. This is a classic joke from college. I'm trying to get more in the habit of telling jokes because I think it's good form. Millennials don't tell very many jokes, and it's something that I always found delightful about boomers and people from the silent generation, like my father, is they always had the ability to kind of soften things up with a nice joke. And some of them are pretty lame. This is about as lame as the jokes come. Again, this is something that I heard in college when I hung around with my math nerd friends. Most of them were getting degrees in things like number theory. So in the 1940s, there is some super secret military project to test out human intelligence. And as part of this exercise, the government has taken the top minds from various different disciplines and has put them through a number of intelligence tests. And some of them are very dangerous. And as a last test of these experts' intelligence, they decide that they're going to lock them in a room with a bunch of canned food, but no ability to access that canned food. They have no ability to open the cans, no tools to do it. And to select from the most intelligent people who might be able to overcome this challenge, in addition to the other qualities they may have, they pick an engineer, they pick a physicist, and they pick a mathematician. And so, of course, they lock them in the room with all of the canned food, and they see how they do. And they come back 30 days later, and they look at the physicist in his room, and he's found an ingenious way by which he can superheat the cans using energy from the light in the window, focusing it and superheating it, and detonating the cans. And although the corn is entirely burned and gets blown everywhere, he's still very reasonably fed. They go and look in on the engineer. And the engineer has devised another ingenious way by which, through his a cord in his left in his room, he's able to essentially wind it around the cans of food, cans of corn, I think it is in this example, and then use a lever contraption to open the can of corn and eat the contents inside. All right, fair enough. They both pass the test. But then they get to the theoretical mathematician, and they open the chamber, and of course, he's long since starved to death, totally unable to open any of the cans of food that have helped him survive. But above his decaying corpse, there's written on the wall very distinctly in his blood, and the words say, I have discovered a truly ingenious proof that demonstrates how I can eat from any can in this room. Proven to the utmost logical rigor. Step 1. Assume that I have a can opener. Ha 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 ha. That's the joke. It's lame. It's a dig at, and sometimes this variation of joke is told with a mathematician. Sometimes it's told with an economist. The lesson is pretty much the same. The lesson of the economist or mathematician joke is that certain ideas or certain theory cripples you to the realities of what's around you. I guess I should kind of contextualize this conversation and why we're even going into this right now. I kind of threw you into the woods. There's been, as always, a lot of back and forth on Substack and Twitter. And the main problem usually is this question over what is the distant right doing? What is it providing? What manifesto is it giving to the world to actually show it what to do? Are you doing something? Are you just sitting around and talking amongst yourselves, theorizing about various things? And I don't exactly know why this is always the case with the distant right, but there's always this assumption that because we describe realistically the constraints that we have attacking government and sort of the forces arrayed against us, that we're somehow black-pilling people. That in order to not be black-pilling, we need to engage with a certain level of realistic policy and tell people what to do in order to be properly doing something, in order to be properly engaging with reality. And again, one Substacker who I shall not name because I think he's quite cross with me talking about him too much, has definitely thrown the gauntlet down, and my friend on Substack called John Arcto, or Anglo-futurist, very much appreciated this. He doubled down on a manifesto of various things we could do to actually move the ball forward realistically in policy. And John Arcto was very frustrated with the fact that many people on the distant right didn't very much think that many of these ideas that came from the manifesto were particularly useful. And he accused well, me in particular, of blackmailing people for being skeptical about policy choices or talking about policy generally. Now, I mean, look, I can tell you what things I would like to implement in policy if I were king. I can tell you what I think we should be doing right now. We talk about it all the time. If you were watching this channel 6 days ago, me and the Traditionalist were on here discussing the latest conference we had with the Old Glory Club in Tennessee, and most of the talks there, mine not so much so, but most of the other talks had a very distinct focus on practical steps people could take in their own lives to increase our leverage and political power. And if that wasn't enough, there was, I mean, this is a project we've been starting for a very, very long time. There is the Old Glory Club, who is running the conference, talking about their on-the-ground efforts to organize young men into fraternal societies for mutual support and for political organization. Is that doing something? I mean, I guess it kind of is doing something. I mean, it is moving the ball forward in terms of community organizing. And, you know, to pick another example, we had John Doyle there talking about the problems with the practical Republican Party on the ground and how that kind of decrepit institution might be restaffed and replaced to be more vitalistic. He also had some very, very choice observations about the kind of idiots who currently run the Republican Party and the Republican Party's lobbying efforts, which I won't repeat here. But, you know, that's followed up by additional talks about how to obtain land and create private associations that are not, or voluntary associations that are sort of minimalistically impacted by civil rights law so that you don't get drawn into legal trouble. There are also talks about attitudinally how to organize, how to, and you know, I think some of my favorite talks, this is obviously not the most useful ones, were about kind of attitudes that were brought to them by people like Deleuze or Tolkien, or any number of authors coming from the American canon. To me, I would consider that doing something. But I've noticed for a certain type of person, that's not really seen as doing something. They want a plan, they want a story about how we're going to take power at the top level. This is obviously something that Aaron McIntyre's new book is very much about. The Total State, which I have not finished reading. I've just ordered it. I'm very much behind everyone else. But as someone who's been a religious reader of his blog and who's been on his show many, many times and has been one of his initial influences, and I certainly have read all of the Italian elite theory people, the Burnhams, the Moscas, the Paretos. This is all under my belt. I kind of know what his book's going to say, and obviously he was at the conference with the OGC talking about his ideas about the total state and how we interact with it. And I think my friend Charlemagne, gave kind of a similar talk. And there is a good deal of skepticism coming down to practical politics, just because we're aware of how practical politics actually works. It's not sufficient to just organize a large political coalition to vote in one direction. It's not reliable. Democratic politics don't work exactly like that. And if you tell people that if you just vote for Ron DeSantis or if you just vote for Trump, and then all of a sudden the government is going to completely change and reconfigure itself, you're going to end up with a lot of disappointment. There are things that need to be done before that. There are groundwork that needs to be laid. The reason why the left is able to wield power and get what they want is because there's a certain number of things that they have done. There's a certain number of institutions that they control, and from that they're able to actually wield power through the molding of public opinion. This is all Italian elite theory stuff, but I think, especially since this is an election year, this is a perspective that's not particularly welcome, because people think that this is just an entreatment to sit back and let the political process go in whatever direction it might, and just throw our hands up in the air, stick our heads in the earth, and just talk about building the Benedict option or something like that. I don't know anyone who's actually doing that, but that's certainly the impression that comes from the sphere that, say, John Arcto from the Anglo-Futurist comes from. And I think he's written another article that I haven't quite gotten through yet, and I might talk to him in the future. But it was very much in reaction to this idea of doing something. I think we should start with kind of approaching this question, and I get more into the particulars of the comparison as we get further into the lecture. But we have to start with what politics is at a fundamental level. Politics, and this is the famous quote that I think everyone attributes this to Benjamin Franklin, because in the HBO series John Adams, he says this. I'm 90% sure that this quote comes from Otto von Bismarck, which might be kind of ironic given one of the people that I'm subtly not mentioning in this live stream, if I can possibly help not mentioning his name, given how little sleep I've had in the last 24 hours. But this is a quote that I'm almost certain comes from Otto von Bismarck, and is sort of one of the principal planks of what we usually call political realism. When people say realpolitik, they usually mean the foreign policy of Otto von Bismarck, who was famously a political realist before sort of the Italian political realist school came into existence. And this is the quote everyone talks about and remembers. This is, politics is the art of the possible, the attainable, the art of the next best. And this is to mean that well, I mean, who knows what this means? It could mean any number of things. But politics is about essentially dealing with reality as it is and getting what you can out of it. And this is one thing that's absolutely 100% true. But I believe that this is one of the most abused statements in all of political history, because it also doesn't take into account how what's possible could change. There's kind of two dimensions of it. There is any political situation where you have to make a decision in the short term, given the constraints on the ground and given what you have in the moment. And then there's doing what you can so that you can slowly conform the universe, slowly conform the world to your preferred vision. The natural follow-up question to the phrase, politics is the art of the possible, is to ask, well, what is possible? This is something that has to be part of the equation because it's something that we have to think of all the time. 90% of what the left asks for would just not be possible in any other era. Transgenderism is a perfect example. Transgenderism for children. If you took transgenderism for children as a political issue and you opened that issue in the 1990s, not only would you lose every single election, people would be seeking to criminally prosecute you for child abuse, almost certainly. The transgender movement changed what was possible, and they did so by not strictly operating in the constrained form of Otto von Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck was an intelligent statesman. He did not obviously mean that the way you win politics is to operate at the lowest possible level, to always go incrementally for the next possible greedy choice. And that's what politics is. I think he meant this much more in a nuanced way. He meant that the art of the politics is both engineering what's possible and also dealing conversely with what you're forced to do. The problem is that this means something a lot for different people. I have this sort of out of order, but we'll just have to roll with it. These slides are always made on the fly, and that's just how these lectures go at podcasts, Fiddler's Green podcasts. Always a little bit out of order. Reality for a political actor is always 100% constrained by what confronts them in their day-to-day life. We have to deal with finances, and those are political. We have to deal with our job, and that is political. And when we deal with finances and our job and the things that confront us in the short term, we have essentially a very pure political question in front of us. We have a certain number of resources. We have a certain amount of power. We have a certain number of objectives. And in these circumstances, it's very, very clear that our goal is to use the power that we have to get our goals and to get more power. This does not really match up with how we talk about politics in this circle right now. When we talk about politics, when we talk about world affairs, when we talk about the change of the culture war, for instance, we were just talking about the increasing acceptance of transgender insanity and all this stuff, we are not talking about things that we control like a statesman controls his army. We do not control this the way that Otto von Bismarck controlled the chancellery of Germany, or Prussia and what would eventually become Germany. We do not control politics. We talk about them at this level the way that any political actor, even in office, would control them. These are hypothetical things that we're talking about. These are broad pieces. These are broad effects that occur over the course of history, and all we can do is kind of observe them and touch them a little bit. This is something that certainly Uncle Yarv, Curtis Yarv, and Mencius Mollberg will talk a lot about. The difference between people who craft policy and the people who craft power. In a situation like we're in right now, where we don't have power, where we're not acting over pieces that we actually control, the question is not really, the real question in front of us is not, how do we craft policy most effectively to achieve our ends, given that we have power? We don't have power. The most important question that confronts us in this day and age are, how do we get power? How do we get power? What's the most effective use of our time, given that we share values and are coalitioned up together directed by some cause to accomplish something for the human race? How do we get power? The policy questions are almost kind of meaningless in this context, in the abstract. This is something that I have to say, this is a question of zones of control. I really hate policy discussions. I wrote this out. I really constrain them because I really hate them, because they constrain our imagination and convince us that we're doing something, all the while they obscure the actual things we can do right now to advance power, or to advance our power. So, for instance, let's review this, and let's review what when people say, why aren't you doing something? Why aren't you doing something? Why aren't you actually trying to change policy? Okay, so there's the Otto von Bismarck style of politics where you are an actor that has power and you're acting in this moment to increase your power and to make sure that your power, the scarce resource that it is actually used to make sure that your vision comes into existence in the most effective way and that you're actually using your power as it is to increase your share of power. That's how politics existed for Otto von Bismarck. He was a political actor, and he was using power he actually had. He was not a political theorist or spectators or people who talk about ideas in the abstract like you and I are talking right now. Maybe this is something that is deceptive for people who are watching this on YouTube. I'm just sitting here in my house in a room with a Yeti microphone speaking into it and talking to you about my political opinions. I don't have levers here that control what Congress does. I don't have Ron DeSantis's number on my cell phone so I can just call him up. This is us discussing politics in the abstract. There's nothing I know of that I can do aside from voting, which in the states I am is incredibly meaningless, that can actually impact these things. So in the Otto von Bismarck sense, what can we actually do? Well, we can build community locally, which if you know anything about what I talk about on this channel, I talk about this all the time. I talk extemporaneously about this in terms of building community, in terms of family, in terms of church, in terms of local political organizations. And if all that is just way too abstract, we are literally pushing forward meetup communities and fraternal societies that I advertise for all the time. And if you haven't heard me talk about this enough or haven't heard me shill this enough on Twitter, please DM me or look into the Basket Weaving Project through the Beowulf Foundation. Or, it's not just the Beowulf Foundation that's running this. It's a variety of different people who are doing this through an organization that we now call Club Weave to get people of sympathetic ideological predisposition to meet up in real life and actually get things done. This is something that is not an abstract hypothetical I'm talking about. This is something that you can actually do. Either building community, solidarity, and incorporating these ideas into your actual local life community, or using the resources we're provided to meet up. Another thing we could do, and some people have done this, building institutions, publishing houses, homeschool networks, fraternal societies like the OGC. I hate to constantly harp on this, but this has been, the third or fourth event we've done this year, and it's amazing how many people are actually building small little institutions like this in our network. Are they all going to succeed? No, but this is actually doing something in a realistic way. This is not theory. This is actually doing something. If people are kind of confused as to what that actually means. Another thing is fraternal housing networks. This was a big. Well, it wasn't a big, it was one lecture, but created a bunch of discussion at the recent OGC conference, was essentially building fraternal organizations and housing networks that had essentially discretional abilities to associate with each other so that wealth could be traded internally and that organization could be done on the inside of these organizations, something that's hard to do without a lot of legal planning or know-how. And I'm very glad that people put effort towards that. Organizing politically in real life, like I said before, going to your local city council meeting, creating political parties. One thing that I was pushing, although this was not one of the lectures given at the last conference, was this idea of automated voting, which I still think is the absolute future of political engagement in this country. Political engagement has to essentially be automated such that organizations like the OGC simply have blocks associated with them. So as opposed for me figuring out who I want to vote for organized dog catcher, I just vote OGC ticket. Or what would be better is to kind of hoist the State Department by its own petard and just pick a color. Like the color of the OGC is, I don't know, teal. So I joined the Teal Coalition. And the Teal Coalition, organized by the OGC, tells me how to vote for all of these minor down ticket ballots that I would ordinarily care about. And If this teal coalition gets large enough, it will start flipping a bunch of the minor government positions that nobody cares about, which means that if you want a minor government job that no one cares about, you have to start talking to the teal coalition. That builds power in an organized way that is time efficient. And although I think people are starting to implement this, and this is certainly a theoretical idea, incrementing this idea forward would actually build power. It would actually get us power. And, you know, and I'll say this too here, further down the list, publishing books, publishing theory, making art. This is something that's kind of a cliche. People roll their eyes at this. This is the Curtis Yarvin idea of planting acorns. And especially in an election year, people will just kind of dismiss this or scoff at this as intellectual wankery. This is just, oh, you know, look, we're red pilling the normies. We're doing our own thing. Look at us. You know, cue the meme that Scrump Monkey always likes to repeat on Twitter, where it's Todd Flanders having an imaginary victory where he's red pilling the normies with art or whatever, because you can't see the results of this. But this is part of advancing the discourse and part of making the discourse amenable to people who are not immediately in your coalition, is essentially creating an aesthetic and a moral vision that it appeals to people. And essential to that is having things like books and art and discourse spaces and theory that align people and make them see the world in a different way and make their ultimate political visions for what's right for humanity act in a more organized fashion towards a common end. And one of these things is creating political content like I am right now. I guess, am I doing something by doing this live stream? I'm plugging my microphone in and gabbing into it. So, I mean, yeah, I guess we're doing something in that way. But see, this isn't what the internet means by doing things. What the internet means by doing things is crafting hypothetical policy positions, like hypothetical Republican Party platforms, and pretending like you are on the cusp of getting elected as a Republican, or you are in the inner circle of someone like Ron DeSantis, or, you know, maybe you're a political operator like Chris Rufo, or although most of what Chris Rufo does is this green section over here. Most of what Chris Rufo does is just investigative journalism. And every now and again, he probably has lunch with a politician who actually can influence policy. Most of it's creating content, organizing, and doing investigations. That's what political... I mean, he did something that was really great this last week. He published an expose on a bunch of transgender clinics in the United States and the abusive practices that went on in there, and the weird government involvement at that level, which is, you know, an amazing piece of expose journalism. And I very much admire Rufo, despite the fact that I do think many of the criticisms that Yarvin and Aaron make of him are accurate. But what the internet wants you to do is they want you to imagine that you're Ron DeSantis or someone more powerful than Ron DeSantis, or the person that's crafting the policy proposal in the think tank that is imminently going to become the first iteration of Ron DeSantis's policy in his first 100 days of being president. And by putting this set of policy proposals together, you're going to change policy, and this is going to be the roadmap for actually accomplishing change. The thing is that this thing in red here that the internet thinks of as doing things, this is just creating political content. It's just talking about politics in the abstract, because none of us are actually advisors to Ron DeSantis. None of us are actually crafting policy in this dimension. We're just sitting here talking about politics. We're creating political content. Now, there could be uses. There could be, I mean, if it would help people, we can go through hypothetical policies, and we're going to do that today. Or we're going to go through somebody else's, and then I'm going to craft a response of my own, and we're going to contrast my response to this mystery person's ideas. And we're going to see how that works out. But we need to get something clear right now. Discussing hypothetical policy ideas is not doing something. It's only doing something in that it creates political content. It is not doing something in terms of all of these other green things. It is not actually talking about or controlling levers that we actually have power over. And rest assured, by the time you think of this super specific, super relevant policy idea that, Ron DeSantis, if you were elected president, or Trump, if you were elected president, could just come into office and do in his first 100 days, that genius, sort of very, very narrowly tailored policy idea, that's going to be irrelevant in 5 months tops. Don't even bother writing a book on it the way that R.N. McIntyre wrote The Total State, or Nina Parvini wrote the Populist Illusion, because by the time that comes around, by the time you publish it, it will already be irrelevant because the political situation will have already changed and you're going to be stuck with a bunch of sawdust. Still, this last week, I was visited by the ghost of Otto von Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck came and visited me as reincarnated as a fairy. We'll call him Otto von Disney. How about that? Will be the person issuing the challenge, and he issued a challenge to me under the idea that I talked too much in the abstract, and I really needed to do something about policy. Why isn't there a distributist or a Dave Green policy proposal that any politician could embrace and engage with in the future and make America great again? I mean, isn't that the object of all of this stuff? So I take Otto von Disney very seriously as the reincarnation of a famous German chancellor whose work in political realism I very much respect. Not to mention his contributions to child entertainment in his Disney form. And certainly, I think this needs to be taken seriously. We need to be political realists. Okay, but what is political realism? Again, the problem with all policy, and I know I'm kind of giving us a long preamble, but this is essential. I could do what the left does and just assume that I could abolish the laws of reality. Everybody will have everything provided for them instantaneously, and they won't abuse it because I'm going to just, my policy idea is to abolish human nature and to abolish scarcity on Earth. And we'll have just luxury gay space communism forever. And not only that, people will take pills so they don't get fat, and they'll have machines and AI so they don't get bored, and people will be happy all the time, and there'll never be any consequences because I have all the power and in my perfect situation, I will be able to just decree that. I mean, is that what people want? I don't think so. There has to be some understanding of what's realistic and what's not. Let me go back to this slide. Maybe I should eliminate my face for this because I'm about to go through some actual texty slides. In order to determine what is possible, since politics is the art of the possible, we need to go through some rules, some ground rules for deciding what actually is good policy, not simply based on outcome, because certainly we judge policy based on outcome, but also judged by just how likely this policy idea is to actually work. How is this policy realistic or unrealistic? Even if we were to imagine I had power, obviously I'm not a policy maker, so even to talk about realistic policy, I would have to imagine I was some politician. But there have to still be some boundaries, otherwise I can just decree gay luxury space communism with no consequences and be done with the matter, and we'll be off to Big Rock Candy Mountain and John Lennon's Imagine for the rest of the evening. We don't have to worry about politics at all. So what are my rules? What are my constraints when actually doing this? So I have a few rules. Whenever I think about policy in any kind of realistic setting, which was already not very realistic since I don't have power, these are the general fundamental laws that I think about. First of all, Let's talk about what's likely to happen. What's likely to happen in the future as a consequence from my policy decisions, either in the power I'm likely to have or the effect that said policy is likely to have in the future. Now, people who watch this channel for a long time know that my background is in essentially math engineering, but it has an emphasis on stats and probability. That's what I did my PhD in, and I taught stats for a very, very long time. What I'm stating here is not the fundamental law of probability. That has to do with sigma algebras and all sorts of real analysis that cause my eyes to melt out of their sockets, let alone lay people. But putting kind of the fundamental law of probability in very, very lay people's terms, kind of looking at it from a frequentist point of view, I say this is the fundamental law of probability. Again, back at the envelope probability. Things that have happened in the past are more likely to happen in the future than things that have never happened. Again, this is kind of a restatement of frequentist probability. You could put it in a Bayesian school probability way of thinking about it as well. But if we're thinking about two policies and we're trying to evaluate how likely they are to, or two consequences, and we're trying to think about how likely they are to occur, the consequence that has happened many times in the past is much more likely to happen than the consequence that has never happened in human history. I don't think that this is so controversial, but you'd be amazed how many people on the internet have a very, very difficult time with this one. They'll start using sort of like logic on you. Well, just because it's never happened doesn't mean that it couldn't happen in the future. Sure. As everyone knows, there are these things that we call black swan events, right? This is something that especially is useful if you are a fan of the author Nassim Nicholas Taleb, right? Nassim Nicholas Taleb talks about events called black swans. And what is a black swan? Well, to tell you the story of the black swan, for a long time, zoologists in Europe classified swans as an exclusively white animal, excluding the possibility of black swans as something that's impossible. Then, when they visited other areas of the world, they discovered a black swan. And then what did they do? They changed the definition of swan to incorporate the black swan. So a black swan is something that your model prohibits because you've never seen it before in the past, and your probability models can only talk about things that you've seen before in the past by definition, by the limitations of science. And because human knowledge is limited, oh my God, you've seen this thing for the first time, and because you've never seen it before, you've excluded it as a possibility. This is also the problem with measuring miracles in a statistical sense. There's no way to scientifically judge whether miracles could happen because science can only measure repeatable things that have happened before in the past. And a miracle by definition is not a repeatable event. So I don't want to get into problems with the materialist worldview, but that's a major one of them. This is also, you might understand this concept perhaps in a positive form in things like, I'm rereading J.R.R. Tolkien with my wife, Lord of the Rings, and he's very fond of this thing called the eucatastrophe. The eucatastrophe is a thing that's never happened before in the past, but it's good, and it happens at the last moment, and it saves everybody. So people will kind of complain about this in Tolkien's books, especially in Lord of the Rings, where the universe is looking a lot more realistic than it does in The Hobbit or his other books, where the heroes have a problem like getting rid of the One Ring, and they ignore all of the easiest ways to get rid of it. Famous on the internet is taking the ring to Mount Doom with the eagles that they have access to. Conversely, another way they could have gotten rid of the wing is taking it across the sea to Valinor, where it would have been permanently out of reach of Sauron and being destroyable by these angelic beings that live there called the Valar, which, if you've read the Silmarillion, then you know what I'm talking about. But what I'm trying to express here is that Tolkien ignores practical ways of dealing with the ring because what he wants to exhibit is a hopeless situation that's brought to a conclusion by a kind of eucatastrophe, something that was never anticipated coming to be and setting things back into order. And a eucatastrophe is something that has, in Christianity and in many other religions, a certain kind of religious centrality to it. But it's something that tactically speaking, you never want to account for. Obviously, humanity itself is looking at some inevitable catastrophes, like the heat death of the universe, or the destruction of the sun destruction of the earth when the sun becomes a red dwarf, or our own inevitable deaths. And when we look at those inevitable dooms, I think it's perfectly fine to religiously say, well, we're facing doom, and all we can do is hope for a eucatastrophe, come what may, a higher power be there for us. But when we're confronted with ordinary things in our lives, ordinary situations, ordinary tactical questions of politics, the way that Otto von Bismarck talks about, we have to proceed under the assumption that there is a certain amount of normalcy to reality, and that things that have happened in the past are more likely to happen in the future than things that have never happened. The second part of this law of probability, not really a law of probability, but a tactical law, an understanding of the universe, was what I call the fundamental law of imponderables. This is another thing that I want to bring when I talk about politics. I'm going to kind of be radical here. I would not be the first right-winger to make this identification. Order is good, chaos is evil. And chaos is the natural tendency of the world, the natural state of the universe before creation, and the natural end of the universe when everything winds down and falls apart. We are living in a universe where the second law of entropy is both a physical reality and a spiritual reality and an informational reality. This is the natural state. Chaos is the natural state, and chaos is bad. Chaos is not suitable for human existences. Therefore, unpredictable circumstances that are brought about by random action almost always end in destruction. I understand that there's a Tolkienic desire for eucatastrophes, and that we all must take this hope of eucatastrophe forward with us as we face our eventual doom, which is waiting for us in one form or the other. But in our tactical approach to reality, we can't just roll the dice and hope that everything ends up in the right way by inviting disaster after disaster after disaster and hoping that somehow, magically, this disaster will make things better in the long run. This disaster will make things, someone's talking about fat tail events in the chat. I did part of my PhD thesis is on fat tail distribution, so I appreciate that. But anomalies aside, we cannot just invite chaos into our lives and hope that good things come out of it. That's not a responsible way to govern yourself. So, for instance, if you have a car that's broken, pushing that car into a tornado is just going to further break it. The tornado is not going to hit the car and then magically deassemble it and reassemble it completely new with the part that was broken fixed. That can't happen. Well, I mean, I guess it can happen technically, right? But that is almost certainly not going to happen, black swan event or eucatastrophe aside, because the state of order that you want is rare, and the state of chaos that the universe tends towards is common and natural, and things will tend towards a state of chaos. The fundamental law of imponderables is the unpredictable circumstance almost always leads to destruction. This is also what engineers call Murphy's Law, if you've heard this in an engineering context before. Whenever you have a piece of code, the worst thing that can happen will happen because what you're dealing with is a complex system. And if one little thing goes wrong, if one bug enters the system, then the whole thing will naturally go wrong, which is why you cannot bet on random actions. And maybe they'll experimentally reveal something, but they are not going to fix anything independently of a larger piece of control. Next law, the fundamental law of normie thinking. I don't even know why I have these in order. I probably should have actually had graphics behind these. I could have had an NPC around this one. The fundamental law of how normies think. This is important. The first two were about what's likely to happen in the future. This one is about how ordinary people behave. this is a problem for a lot of the internet, because a lot of the internet has the certain idea that not only do people behave as rationally as they do, people behave more rationally than they themselves do. And certainly this is something that most liberal philosophy textbooks make a mistake about when they talk about people having a proper understanding of their own freedom outside of constraints that teach them what is good and lead them to choose the good over the evil. Or if we, as liberals or progressive liberals, think that somehow we just put all options in front of people, do heroin or not do heroin, use pornography or not use pornography, do exercise or just sit on the couch and eat junk food all day. When we're surprised when this ends in bad ways, it's because we have an improper way of understanding how normies think and how they emote and how they conceptualize progress. Ordinary people only have emotions about things that are right in front of their faces. If something bad happens to somebody and they don't see it, they don't have an empathetic reaction to it. If it happens to someone that's outside of their social circle, they do not have an empathetic reaction to it. There's no force of humanity that makes people feel things for other people that are distantly related to them, both in time and space and genetics. Additionally, normies take what they have for granted. I have a house and air conditioner right now. This is something that would have been unheard of. Well, I guess the house wouldn't be, but the size of the house certainly. And this is an apartment, and it's bigger than the house my grandmother grew up in. Or at least I think it is if I measure the square footage properly. What I have right now in most cases in human history would have been considered the absolute lap of luxury for anyone living in anything approaching our species' normal conditions of existence. Do I feel like a king? Hell no. I feel like an ordinary workaday schlub because I am thinking like a human, and because everyone else around me has this, and because this is the norm, I obviously take this for granted. And finally, normies always assume that the best thing will happen to them in any random development, which is, of course, the exact opposite of Murphy's Law. Additionally, I'm going to introduce here the fundamental law of democracy. And the fundamental law of democracy is that when uncontrolled, democratic bodies do not act tactically. They return to the preferred behavior of their median member. So, for instance, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party's tendency is always to give in. Therefore, always to give in to the Democrats, right? So, therefore, in absence of anyone guiding them or overviewing their decisions or making them make the right choices, they will inevitably just compromise and try to get money brought into their home districts. That's their natural tendency. That's how they have been trained. The Democratic Party is a party of activists. Their inclination is to naturally get more money and gibs for constituent victim groups. So in the absence of any control or oversight, they will always try to grab more funding for their constituencies. And with those two observations, you can pretty much predict how Congress is going to act. But we can't predict otherwise. And, people are, what's so unusual about this? This fundamental law of democracy isn't even very interesting like the last ones were. Well, you see, this is very, very important when we get to the next fundamental law here. Now, this fairy that contacted me, this ghost of the past, Otto von Disney, he is very, very fond of these things called compromises. Compromises are something that's been a staple of the democratic political order since the beginning of our constitutional republic, and probably even before under the Articles of Confederation, and actually even during the signing of the Declaration of Independence by Benjamin Franklin. And Thomas Jefferson wrote it, and then Benjamin Franklin and John Adams edited the hell out of it. It was a collective document. It was the work of many hands. And compromises had to be made. And of course, when the Constitution was signed, compromises had to be made. And when the debates on slavery raged, compromises had to be made. And when the New Deal happened, compromises had to be made. And when the Hart-Celler Act and the 1964 Civil Rights Amendment happened, compromises had to be made. Now, if you are a studier of political history like I am, you might ask yourself, and I'm going to hide my video. Well, maybe I will. I might. Let me discuss this. If you study political history like I have, and you look at all of the compromises made in our country or in other people's country, democratically, in bodies like the Grand Assembly or Congress in the United States or Parliament in the United Kingdom, you might be asking yourself, who wins the compromises? These compromises are between belligerent parties. They have diametrically opposed ideas on how the country is going to ultimately evolve. What causes one side to win a compromise and one side to lose a compromise? Is there any rule that dictates who wins and who loses? Or do both sides win? Or can both sides win? Let's put aside whether both sides win or whether the compromise can ever be completely mutually beneficial, because I think that when we look at most of human history and we look at the various compromises that have been made, especially over the course of the United States, you'll realize quite definitively that one side got what they wanted and the other side got screwed. Now, is there a universal quality that separates the winners from the losers in this fundamental art of the compromise? Well, it's because the winners understand the fundamental law of compromises. And here I'm going to hide my video and we're going to discuss the fundamental law of compromises. A compromise between two parties in the present does not bind the actions of said parties in the future. I'm going to say that again. I'm going to say that again twice. A compromise between parties in the present does not bind the actions of said parties in the future. A compromise between parties in the present does not bind the actions of said parties in the future. Throughout our history, the party that has understood this has won, and the party that has understood that has lost. Now, what does this mean? What this means is, except in periods of exceptional order and trust, where both parties are just so religiously dedicated to their word that they are frozen in amber to the words that they have signed on this document, which happens very, very rarely and only in early periods of civilization, which we're certainly not in. In anything other than those circumstances, a compromise is made one day, and then immediately the question comes afterwards. Okay, now that I got what I wanted from this compromise, how can I use this to get more power and make sure that what the other person got doesn't actually happen? Right? Some people might remember a certain compromise that Reagan made, exchanging amnesty for border enforcement. I remember that compromise. It was the most recent compromises in recent history. The Democrats certainly got amnesty for all illegal immigrants in the 1980s. That definitely happened. Did Reagan get his border enforcement? Speaking as a Californian, that would be no. And that's because the act of amnesty made the enforcement of the border harder. The same thing is true for the slavery compromises. You get concessions on slavery in the short term. The other side gets states that vote against slavery in the long term. Who wins that compromise? It's not hard to see who. There's always a side that wins a compromise, and the side that wins the compromise is the one that can use the compromise to get more power where the other person has some kind of symbolic little bauble that they can hold up and go, look, 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 I got this little bauble. That's a compromise. This is an achievement because I made the compromise. And this compromise, of course, will last forever. No one will betray this compromise. And even if they do betray the compromise, the fact that they betrayed the compromise is a moral victory for me because it will demonstrate the fact that they have broken the sacred compromise. Does anyone not vote Democrat? I mean, I guess some white people in California don't vote Democrat because they broke the great compromise with Ronald Reagan, but it's a pretty minuscule percentage of the population. In 10 years, nobody remembers the ink of the sacred compromise you signed. What people do remember is which side gained power from it. And why do they do that? Because compromises between parties in the present do not bind the actions of said parties in the future. They can undo that compromise. And furthermore, if the compromise is give me something now, so I get something later, you can take what that person gives you now and never give them what they want in the future, because by the time what they want by the time the future comes, you could be out of office. People could have forgotten the compromise. You could have passed additional laws that amend the compromise using the power that you got now. If you do not understand this law, your compromises will suck. All right, guys, you following me? All right. The Otto von Disney fairy who visited me was not too happy about these observations, but I'm sure he would accept my caveats of realism. This is the realism that has to surround all policy making. So we're going to play a game with Otto von Disney. Otto von Disney is going to recommend some policies. Fair enough. Of course he does. That's what Otto von Disney likes doing. He likes being realistic. He likes doing things, and doing things means inventing hypothetical policies that could be enacted by future Congresses or presidents that are listening to either of us, which are probably nobody right now. However, we're going to have some ground rules here, okay? So whenever Otto von Disney makes a policy recommendation, we're going to pay close attention to the assumed power that he uses for his idea. And whatever power he assumes for his idea becomes a power that we can assume we've been given. And then we can see if using the powers he assumed he had to make his policy, if we can come up with a better policy, right? So just so it's fair, right? Just so it's fair. I think that's a pretty fair contest, wouldn't you say? That, therefore, at the end of this process, at the end of this live stream, we'll have two manifestos. We'll have Otto von Disney's manifesto, which, he's created to be realistic. And we'll also have my manifesto. And we'll see which one is more effective. And just in case the objection from Otto von Disney is that I'm being more realistic, the limitation is this: I will not use any powers. I will not assume any powers to myself that are not implicitly assumed by Otto von Disney's policy proposals. That way, we are using an equivalent amount of power, and we can evaluate how good or how well these policies would do for a right-wing constituency or for people who have our values. And that can be a good way of examining them. Now, I don't need to repeat this again to show you that, to kind of take a step back here and say, this is an incredibly hypothetical game that we're playing here. But this is the game that everyone is playing when you read their manifesto from a Substack or when you read their policy ideas from a Substack. It is a what-if experiment. It is a what I would do if I had power experiment. It could be useful showing how we think about power and to hopefully give you guys a better idea of how to think about power. But it is just a thought experiment. This is not the same thing as improving your life or organizing or getting involved in the myriad activities that we discussed continuously at our previous conference, or starting your own conferences, or reaching out and being more social in your own life and finding those a similar value to you, to be more ready for whatever our chaotic age throws us in the future. This is not that. This is not actually doing something. This is a hypothetical. But let's have some fun with this, because I think Otto von Disney has some very, very good ideas, or I mean, at least some ideas that I think are quite interesting as thought experiments, certainly. So Otto von Disney, his first problem is that he does not like the current state of the sexual marketplace. And certainly everyone who's watched this show knows that I hate the sexual marketplace as it exists. In fact, that was my first big video. One of my first big series of videos was What's Wrong with the Sexual Revolution, the video. That was, and that's what my channel, for the longest time, that's what my channel was known for. So here, I'm very glad to say that Otto von Disney has some great ideas on how we can take this really deplorable state of affairs that men and women find themselves in, where nobody's getting married, where men are becoming more and more timid, and where people just aren't even having sex very much anymore, and the birth rate's plummeting. Let's see what we can do to improve things. The ideas that Otto von Disney lists in his manifesto are: 1, destigmatize laddishness. Make sure that the male gaze is destigmatized. Make sure that inebriated or drunken sex between young people is destigmatized. Make sure that large age gaps between men and women are destigmatized. Okay. Not so sure that I'm on board with that one so much, but I can definitely see it. Always when I hear the word laddishness, which is the word that Otto von Disney uses for this set of male behaviors, I always associate this with a sort of early aughts kind of culture that came about in things like American Pie and How I Met Your Mother and The Hangover. And in particular, when I think of laddishness, I think of one British BBC television show called Coupling, which was, I don't know, I feel like it's like British Friends, but laddishness, it was very much an associated with that show. And the idea is these are all kind of guys in their early 20s, and they sleep with a lot of women, and they have a lot of extramarital affairs, but it's all in good fun. It's all in good cheer. And they're going to learn their lesson eventually. They're just growing up. This is just what lads do. They go around and have a bunch of promiscuous sex. And Otto von Disney is very concerned that modern Zoomers they're just not having enough sex, and they need to reassert their laddishness more. I understand the concern. Second, conversely, give women legal financial recourse for relationships that go on too long. This is something that we talked about a little bit, and this is the also very common problem of what I call situationships. And I know that this is not necessarily agreed on. What does it mean for a relationship to go on too long? But this is something that you see a lot in my age bracket, the sort of late 30s age bracket, is you see a lot of girls who enter their 30s and they're very, very concerned about getting married. And they're in a relationship with a guy who's not marrying them and probably never will, but they think that if they stay in the relationship long enough, they'll get married, and that eventually they get old and, they're 39, just broken up, and their prospects for having another relationship with a man in time to get pregnant are exceedingly low, and it's a total disaster. This is something that I talk about a lot, and I think it's really, really horrible that this situation has come to pass. And it's quite destructive. And I say that my counterpart, Otto von Disney, I should really start saying Otto von Disney. It's hard to say. My counterpart, Otto, is also very concerned about this. And His solution is to allow women to sue men for alimony in these relationships that go too long. Okay, fine. The third idea is to control deepfake porn and revenge porn. Fair enough. Fourth is to emotionally support men with cost-free porn addiction rehabilitation centers. I'm not exactly sure how the porn rehabilitation centers are cost-free, but that's exactly what you need to stop porn use. You don't need to stop it before it starts. You need to let it happen and then send people to rehab clinics to get clean. Sure. And then the fifth one is to control the media depiction of white women to remove the Karen stereotype. Okay. I mean, there are some problems with these ideas. I think that encouraging male promiscuity is bad because male promiscuity leads to women having high body counts. And this is something that I go into in my own video on the sexual revolution. But if you want a more modern take on this, I would encourage you to view the work of one Ho Math, which is a terrible YouTube channel name. And it is like the general red pill stuff that we've all heard 1,000 times, but he does it with really, really keen engineering diagrams. And he seems to be a very level-headed guy. So I feel safe recommending him to people. And if you're really unconvinced on this, this is the problem that a lot of people make when they talk about men and women in relationships. Men and women in a relationship market, these are not two separate organisms. They are one organism. If men sleep with a lot of women when they're young, like if a certain set of elite men are rakish and sleep with tons of women, that cannot occur without an enormous number of women in that same dating market having high body counts, which we know from experience or just observation of reality. The high body counts leads to women who are less attached to the men that meet later. So number one, this point right off the bat encourages the very behavior that is going to destabilize a healthy dating market right up front. Second point, give women legal recourse for relationships that go on too long. Otto compared this to breach of promise laws, which is when you promise someone you'd engage them and then you never actually married them. The problem is that this idea can't possibly work via the laws of probability, specifically, or I should say the law of imponderables, right? You remember that law of imponderables we said where you toss something in a chaotic situation and you just see what happens? If you give women... First of all, how can we characterize when a relationship's gone on too long? That's one thing. The situations where women end up in situationships forever, sometimes it's the man leading the woman along. Sometimes it's the woman leading the man along. I've heard of women who have turned down engagements multiple times because they're holding a flame for some other alpha guy that they banged in their 20s. Through much the same process being commended in Otto's first point. And now they're in this situationship and they don't want to break up with the guy because they'd be alone in their 30s, but they don't want to marry him because he's below their standards and they're stuck on their highest setting. It's impossible to figure out in these situationships without marriage who's in the fault. That's why we had marriage and not situationships. Because marriage had ground rules where it was very, very easy to see, well, not very easy, but at least it was easier to see who is at fault in the regulation of them. When it's these situationships, we don't know who's at fault. We also don't know what constitutes something that's too long. Is the woman who's in a 6-year situationship going to get alimony, but the woman who's in 3 2-year relationships not going to get alimony from any one of the people? Furthermore, if women know they're getting alimony from these situationships, they'll be more willing to engage in these never-ending cohabitations because they'll be assured that they'll have financial reward at the end. And furthermore, to add a third layer of problems, this also means that women will be encouraged to only date and cohabit with men who could possibly be suable for damages, aka only very, very rich men. This is a disaster waiting to happen, and the only way it could be resolved is through some judicial system coming in and sorting out the wheat from the chaff, considering or assuming that these cases ever go in front of a judge to begin with, which is very, very questionable. I brought this idea to my wife of giving women the ability to sue boyfriends for cohabiting with them too long without a proposal of marriage or without actual marriage. And we both came to the conclusion of this point. The situationships that we know where the man is obviously at fault are also the situationships that if this legal option were available, the woman would be least likely to sue. In the situationships where it's very likely that the woman is at fault, or the woman is holding out a flame for somebody else, or indefinitely prolonging the relationship, those situationships would be more likely for the woman to sue, not just based on psychological dimensions of the people involved. The more selfish the individual, the more selfish the individual woman, the less sort of hopelessly in love she is with the guy, the more likely she is to use this legal avenue to destroy the guy's finances. Which means that we've opened up a legal avenue for sociopaths that's not going to be used by people who are genuinely hurt by the situation. That's pretty questionable. As for the other ideas, good enough, I suppose. I don't know. I think there's more effective ones. But let's take a step forward. What powers did this assume? When Otto made these recommendations, when he made the recommendation to restructure the legal system, to allow people to sue each other for situationships that went on too long, when he said that he was going to destigmatize lavishness or essentially control media depictions of white women who were controlled Karen, or who were called Karens as a racial slur, or when he said that he was going to conversely control how people entered into relationships or how they behaved with pornography. Well, the powers that are being assumed here is that, 1, I can control cultural stigma. 2, I can regulate social media. 3, I can reconfigure legal regulations and relationship laws. And 4, I have influence over media depictions. With those powers that Otto von Disney has so generously bestowed upon me, I wonder if I could do anything that would be more effective as a policy proposal than the 5 things he recommended. Here are my recommendations. Here's how we fix the sexual marketplace. Stigmatize promiscuity. Flat out. Scale back the extractive power of divorce laws and restrict no-fault divorce. That's fairly sensical. We have very, very punishing alimony laws, and it's very, very easy to get divorces. I'm not saying get rid of no-fault divorce altogether. I'm saying making it a little harder and to establish who's at fault first before the divorce goes through, and at least establish who's at fault as a condition for getting alimony to cut down on the number of divorces initiated by women and make marriage a more inviting prospect for men that have some financial means. Legally paygate all pornography. This is not my idea. This is not even a radical idea. This is Inez Stepman's idea from the Independent Women's Forum. This is a mainstream normicon position. You just make a little law that says if you deal in pornography that has an age gate, you have to charge money for it. You have to have a credit card for age verification purposes. This will immediately cut down on the amount of pornography distributed. It will cut down on the ease of access. A huge dopamine trap will immediately be removed from the online space. A huge thing that's causing men to be sort of insular and not laddish, as Otto puts it. Not being in tune with their sexuality and always just hiding behind a computer screen. That will be removed if we remove the easy access to pornography across the board. Don't let people get addicted and then send them to rehab clinics. Make it harder to access. Here's another one. Tax high-speed dating apps for matches. For instance, Tinder. Okay. Tinder's model allows women to reject like thousands of men every day, which leads to the situation where all men are competing, or I should say a very, very few number of men are competing for all women, and all women are competing for a very, very few number of men because of the hypergamy relationship that's been demonstrated again and again and again and again and again. We cannot have Tinder rule our relationships. We have to undermine its business model. Now, luckily for us, when it comes to private businesses, it is incredibly easy to destroy businesses. Businesses almost always operate on razor-thin margins, at least in the modern world. All you have to do is provide a little bit of cost behind one of their core load-bearing elements, and the entire business model falls into the dust. For instance, how about you tax these matchmaking corporations for via the number of matches they provide their users every day? Meaning that it would be impossible to show anyone more than 5 new matches on any given day. Just like the ordinary matchmaking operations used to do. If you went to a matchmaker, an online matchmaker in the early aughts, either one of the social media style ones that was based on Facebook or an actual one, they would give you a finite number of matches. Now, I don't care if you use the best AI algorithms in the world to get you those matches. If the women are only seeing 5 matches a day, the hypergamy is going to be incredibly suppressed, especially since to be effective, the algorithm is going to have to give them matches that are not already matched. Immediate fix, a simple tax. 5, shut down OnlyFans. I'm sorry, it's pornography, and it probably is guilty of some form of prostitution. I don't think we have a legal hurdle to do that, especially since I'm controlling that. 6, encourage positive depictions of sexual virtue in the media, and negative depictions. They need to be taught to be good at business. They need to be taught to be good lads, and not in the sense that you're jerking off to porn, in the sense that you're there for each other and loyal and working together on a common objective, usually personal excellence. That's what young men need to be mentored on. They do not need to be mentored into being rakes or sleeping with a large number of women, if indeed that is possible for a majority of men, which it's just statistically not. Okay, ideas. Are these unrealistic? That's a good question. Are they unrealistic? I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? I mean, I am only using these powers. I'm only using the same amount of assumed power that Otto used for his own. I'm stigmatizing promiscuity. Well, gee, he destigmatized the male gaze and inebriated sex. So he can control stigma in his examples. Okay, wow, I'm legally gating all pornography. Well, regulating social media use and the sexual marketplace was one of the things he used to deliver one of his policy ideas. Oh, I'm controlling depictions in social media to make sexual virtue look good and sexual vice look bad. Well, he's destigmatizing the Karen stereotype, so he must be using that power too. Idea, better idea, across the board. We'll have to kind of consolidate here a little bit, but let's go on. There's lots to get to. There's lots to get to here. The second idea we're going to review is coalition building. Now, this is another part of Otto's plan that kind of eluded me a little bit in this regard, in my conversation with him. So Otto is very concerned about building the best possible multi-ethnic coalition in the new America. This is something that is also a concern for me. I think both he and I know that democratic politics, as degraded and stupid as they are fundamentally coalitional. They're fundamentally about building coalitions, right? Fair enough. And as we all know, the coalition of the Republican Party is declining. It is becoming less and less prominent. It is becoming something that's further and further from the levers of power. How do we fix this? Well, Otto's idea is to praise Jews and Israel a lot more than we already do, to get Jewish media support and money. Okay. Second plan is to praise Brahmin Indians a lot, flatter the hell out of them, and in exchange, get their support, supposedly, and an immigration pause. The third idea is to disown and publicly shame pro-life maximalists. So as everyone knows, Roe v. Wade was abolished, actually almost a year ago now. And in the wake of the abolition of Roe v. Wade, there's been an enormous backlash against pro-lifers across the board, which has been very, very destructive to the prospects of the Republican Party electorally. And this has been a huge problem. And Otto's of the opinion that this is basically the fault of a certain group of people that he calls pro-life maximalists. And what we need to do is we need to get up in public and we need to tell everyone in America how bad pro-lifers are and how they're all a bunch of religious fundamentalists and how they have no place in the Republican Party. We need to aggressively sideline them. This is part. And then once everyone sees us defenestrate our loyal supporters, they'll be like, oh, hey, look, they defenestrate people who've supported them for years. We should join their party. This is the coalition we want to be part of. You know, they beat up the unpopular kids. So let's join them. I mean, I'll just briefly go over, we're not really assuming very many powers here. We're assuming that we can control the messaging that the Republican right-wing parties have. We assume that we can control the attitudes of the demographics in the coalition, and we can shame and chastise, misspell that, important right-wing coalition members. There are some huge problems with these ideas that Otto has here. There are some really huge problems. We have to kind of go back to the idea of a compromise, or really, this is more the fundamental law of normie thinking. What was one of our fundamental laws of normie thinking? You always take what you have for granted. You always take what you have for granted. You always take what you already have for granted. You always take what you already have for granted. I'm saying that so that it is impressed in our skulls when we consider these ideas. Okay, you can't sell something to somebody that they think they already have. They're not going to perceive you or a threat to take something away as credible if it's never ever happened before in history. Let's look at the first thing with the Jewish community and the Republican Party, or I should say the Zionist and Israeli cause and the Republican Party. I have never seen a political party so deeply phthalate a coalition of people that has consistently voted against them as the Republican Party has to the Jewish community and the Zionist cause. They are down on their knees. They are giving it their all. They could not crawl before this cause more. They could not give more. They could not effuse more about them. We are the biggest slut. The Republicans are the biggest sluts in the universe for the Jewish people and Israel. Regardless of how you feel about those people, what is uncontroversial is just how much the Republican Party wants to get down and service them in the dirtiest possible way. They want to be used so badly, and they're not even asking anything for it. It's been 40 years of them putting out and putting out and putting out and putting out, and they've gotten absolutely nothing for it, and they're coming back for a second helping. They're coming back for a sixth helping now, a sixth helping of getting nothing from the Jewish community in Israel, and they're going in and praising them even more. Oh, hot diggity. They can't get enough. Is this an ideal place to do an exchange? This is impossible to do an exchange from this position. This is an impossible situation to negotiate from. Look, I actually don't even have anything against the Jewish community or Israel. I'm completely neutral on this. But I know thing or two about negotiations and relationships. So every now and again, I'm one of those guys who's had a bunch of friends who were women in my 20s. I don't really have any anymore because I'm married, and that's cringe. I think men that have women friends in real life, that's kind of not, I don't think that's very seemly, right? It leads to all sorts of problems. But I did back in my 20s, right? And because I was always in the friend zone for being too much of a nice guy, they would always tell me their problems. Their problems usually involved boyfriends not committing to them. And guess what? They were constantly putting out again and again and again and again and again. And the question was, why aren't they marrying me? And the other question was, well, what if I threatened to withdraw sex and try to kind of negotiate that for marriage? You can't do that anymore. He already has what he wanted. And moreover, because he thinks like a human, he thinks that what he has is granted and he's always going to get it. This is not something, you can't, presumably, right? Presumably, you could threaten to leave him if he doesn't marry you. But that's not going to psychologically, it's going to psychologically register, not as a negotiation, not as something that he's buying that he wants, but as something that you're threatening to take away from him. And he's going to perceive that as an attack, and that's going to be perceived as negative, and he's not going to react well to that. Humans do not react well to threats. They absolutely do not. So I'm sorry. I must have had this conversation with at least 2 women sometime in college years. And the answer is, I really don't see how you could leverage something once you've already given it to them. And I'm sorry for this first idea. We can't leverage support for Jews in Israel once the right-wing coalition in this country has already given it to them. No Jew in this entire country thinks that Republicans or normie conservatives or conservatives or Christians generally are going to withdraw support for Israel. It's possible, it's happening slowly, but they can't possibly perceive it. They can't possibly perceive it. Why? For the same reason that the guy who had the girlfriend who just slept with him with no requirement of commitment could never imagine her leaving him, because he's gotten it so consistently, he just thinks that this is what the universe has bestowed on him. It's not anything particular to Jews. This is just human nature. When you've given something away for free, you can't negotiate with it anymore. Even if in some abstract, objective worldview sense, they're in need of it. The guy could be the ugliest guy in the world. He could have no ability to get another date once you left him if you're a woman sleeping with this guy. He could be some kind of Norbit weirdo, and you're a perfect 10. But because you've been putting out, and for years and years and years and years and years, he will not be able to conceptualize the reality without your support, and therefore your continued indulgence of his desires will not be perceived as a negotiating chip. This is not possible. And if you don't believe me, about, 6 months ago, I had a conversation with my, I guess it was an old friend, but I don't know if he's friends with him anymore after this conversation. This is a YouTuber called King Crocoduck. And back in the day, King Crocoduck was a YouTuber who was an anti-SJW, skeptic, atheist style YouTuber. However, during the Gaza conflict that erupted in October of 2023, he became a very, very ardent Zionist. Fair enough. Look, there's nothing more noble than supporting your own people and loving your own people and wanting to fight for your own people. Unfortunately for King Crocoduck, his ardent support of Israel kind of contradicted with his track record over the past 7 or 8 years of doing YouTube of being ardently against identity politics. And people knew this, and people brought up his past. And so what happened was a bunch of special pleading about how his group was different. And so I also kind of challenged him on this. Not because, again, I'm particularly hostile to Israel. Israel is just another country. It's just another people. That's not me. That's all it is. It's no better or no worse. And, I'm perfectly, and again, like I said, there's nothing more noble in this world than, well, again, there's loving God is more noble than loving your own people. But aside from that, there's something more noble than loving your own people. And I would never judge anyone for this. But I started a conversation with King Crocoduck with one experiment. I said, I am going to acknowledge that Israel has a right to exist and the Jews have a right to a state of their own. I want King Crocoduck to validate any indigenous European identity in a way that is politically meaningful. Meaning not in the modern state sense where everyone who sets foot on Germany is immediately German, or not in the 19th century state sense where it's just that nationalism is just loyalty to the state apparatus itself. What I want from King Crocoduck is to acknowledge that the Germans are a people in the same way that the Jews are a people, and they have a right to the state in the same way as the Jews have a right to their own state. Or it doesn't even have to be German. It just has to be any indigenous European peoples. It can be Poles. It can be English. It can be Southern American whites. It can be Northern American WASP whites. The Boston Brahmins. It can be the people from Orania. It can be the people from Rhodesia. It can be any one of these core ethnic European identities. Will he validate any one of them in a way that is politically meaningful? I spent 2 hours in conversation with King Crocoduck, walking him through comparisons between any given European people and the Jewish people, and I could not get him to make that concession. And the reason why I could not get him to make that concession is because he felt threatened by the existence of any nationalism that had a European character and that had some kind of ethnic component to it, in the same way that Jewishness has an ethnic component to it. I mean, the nation of Israel embraces Jewish atheists. It's not purely religious. But I could not get it after 2 hours of doing this with somebody who was already sympathetic to my politics and who I had kind of an internet relationship with for 5 years. I could not do it. And that's because King Crocoduck was, like many people, he was stuck in a previous mode of thinking. What he had, the deal he remembered from the 90s, where Jews were able to assert this identity and Gentiles were not, he assumed that he just had this for granted. And why would he give up something that he had for granted? There is no feeling of danger. This is not a compromise that can ever happen. And a similar thing happens with the whole idea of that Otto has for praising Brahmin Indians, or effusively saying how great Indians are, which, look at this. Look, I work in tech. I work in machine learning. I work all the time with Brahmin Indians. I actually am quite fond of Brahmin Indians, at least at an individual level, when they're very, very educated. They're very fine people. And I've never had a conflict with these people. That's fine. But here's the thing. First of all, praising them isn't going to do anything. Like, I could just sit here and talk about how great Indians are all the live long day. Like, Indians are great, Brahmins are great, the gay caste system and curry and coding and Ramajan and I'm just throwing out random Indian things, but it's this will do absolutely nothing to get Indians to vote in a coalition against immigration. So right now, the chief beneficiary of immigration to both Canada and the United States is the Indian community. And Indians know this. Indians also vote for the Democratic Party, even though the Democratic Party is obviously going to be against their interests in the long run. Everyone can see this is going to happen in the long run. No amount of praising Indians is going to change that, because the ordinary reality for most Indians in this country are, if Democrats are keeping the immigration floodgates open, at least until mass immigration shifts from India to Africa, the power of the Indian American community or Indian Canadian community increases. They would be politically stupid not to do that. And sweet talking is not going to sweet talk them out of this. And you know why? Because Indians have already been sweet talked by the Democrats. Once more, I mean, Indians, like, aside from sort of online bans notwithstanding, you know, other than like the iHypocrite chat or Reddit, Indians are not like white people. They're not like, they don't go through college with professors that teach them that they're the worst people who ever existed. And in the meantime, they're still part of the coalition of the oppressed. And so they're getting all sorts of buttery praise coming from the left. They don't need to have random internet celebrities praise them. And they're certainly not going to change their opinions if the Republican parties start singing their praises from the rooftops. This is not a negotiation that's happening. Here's an alternative. If you just shut down immigration, now this is how you negotiate with this. I have a plan to get Indians to vote Republican. You turn them into white people, or if you're a purist, you can just say you can turn them into white adjacent people. And there's an easy magical formula to do this. You just totally end Indian migration, and you communicate them that this is not a pause. There's not going to be an opening of the floodgates from the subcontinent again. The demographics of the United States and Canada are what they are. You will always be a minority. And secondly, whites are on top here. Communicate that in whatever way you can. If you communicated that, understanding Indian psychology the way I do, admittedly from anecdotal experience, the Indian Americans and Indian Canadians that are here will be falling over themselves to reclassify themselves as white. They will do everything to be classified as white. They will be desperately trying to get into marriages with white people, especially Indian women, which, you know, might solve some of the dating problems for young white men. Just guys, put a ring on it. That's my only request. But this problem will solve itself if the demographics of the United States and Canada stabilize or solidify. You don't need to praise them. You don't need to effusively sing how great they are from the rooftops. This is not something you need to do. But do you know who you do need to praise? Your own side. Let's go on to my proposed solutions. Okay, we're not really talking about anything that requires power other than managing our coalitions and how we talk about various different people. When you're doing a negotiation between racial coalitions, play hard to get. Do not praise coalitions or ethnic groups or other peoples that routinely denigrate yours. I'm not going to say, we can talk about which types of people repeatedly engage in the anti-white rhetoric. I'm not going to name names. And never, ever, ever, ever insult another race or people or ethnicity. It's not even like I'm afraid of the YouTube terms of service. It's just gauche and low class, and it's bad politics. But on the other hand, you never praise a coalition or collective group that seems to be in the active process of denigrating your own. That is an ironclad rule. That makes you look weak. That makes you look like what the alt-right, which Otto might have been a part of back in the day, and makes you look like what the alt-right used to call a cuck. And it's not hard to see why, because you're praising somebody who's fucking you over. I'm sorry, I'm being very, very profane on this podcast. Like I said before, end immigration, stabilize demographics. I think actually Otto agrees with that, so that's a point of agreement. Always praise true coalition believers publicly, even if you have to demote them privately. So with the pro-lifers, let's say that we've overextended on the pro-life cause. Again, like I've said many times before, I do not believe that targeting Roe v. Wade was good politics. But if I minimize my thing, you can see my face here. Fundamental rule of coalitions is you do not insult or denigrate people who have been loyal to you. I don't know how you play politics if you do. If you take your loyal soldiers and you chastise them publicly, they ain't gonna be loyal no more. There's a scene from The Lion King that depicts that I think Mr. Otto von Disney should study. That's the death of Scar. What happens? Scar gets Scar, the lion that betrayed Simba. He gets cornered by Simba, who's way more powerful than him now. And instead of owning his crimes, what does he say? Oh, those hyenas, they made me do it. Oh, they're horrible, horrible people. And then what happens? Simba doesn't kill him. The hyenas do. Because if you insult people for believing things, for following causes that you led them to, and then in defeat what you do is you toss them under the bus and you call them names, they will never forget that. They will be your enemies for life. And furthermore, after you betray them, everyone will know what you do to your loyal soldiers. The second somebody is not useful to your coalition, they'll get thrown right out. That means definitionally, your coalition is worth less. You praise your enemies, you punish your friends. No one wants to be part of that coalition, which is one of the reasons why no one wants to be part of the Republican coalition, because they routinely do this. Lastly, if I had the powers given to me by Mr. Otto von Disney, I would acknowledge and praise loyal ethnic groups, particularly those of indigenous European origin. Now look, I am a person who does not believe that race in and of itself is a group designation that has very much meaning. But there are subgroups that fall under that broad umbrella of whiteness that the left loves to hate so much. The left loves to hate them, and they're part of our coalition. They need to be recognized as peoples with their own interests and their own rights, just as the left talks about the African American community, or the left in Canada talks about the Native American or First Nations community. If you mainstream that kind of language in your party talk, you will revolutionize politics in America and in Europe instantly. And once more, before you tell me that this is unrealistic, all I'm doing is using the powers that were already part of the assumptions in the ideas of Otto von Disney. Here's the big one. Here's the big idea of Otto von Disney. His last idea of the night was, this is how we're going to end white guilt and the racial conflict in the United States. It's a multi-step grand bargain that can't possibly fail. Now, these numbers I actually took from Otto von Disney's article, and the numbers are important. I did the calculations and he did the calculations. So we're going to create a grand bargain, and we're going to end white guilt and race conflict once and for all. First, we're going to pay reparations to black people. And this isn't going to be any paltry reparations. We're going to pay them real reparations. I was surprised to see this number, but this is actually the number he lists. It's going to be 4% of the entire federal budget for 80 years. The federal budget is $7 trillion, which means 4% of that is $280 billion a year, which is enough to give every African American something like somewhere between $200,000 and $500,000 across their life. This is enough to make them essentially upper middle class, every single one of them. 4% of the federal budget, $280 billion a year. In exchange, in this grand bargain, and affirmative action, and DEI, and, again, this is clarified later, don't instantly end CRA. Slowly roll back the CRA, right? This is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Of course, we should note that an enormous number of government employees are only employed because of the Civil Rights Act. Again, I need to minimize my video here. An enormous number of the government's employees are only employed because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and would immediately lose their job if it didn't exist. But we're going to slowly roll back the 1964 CRA as Congress decides, as part of this compromise, right? Okay. Otto's idea then is white people will get really, 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 really angry when they see all the money that the government is wasting, and they will develop white identity because they're just so angry. And then this is going to result in future dividends. This is a deal. On the surface, let's look at what we're getting. The Democratic Party receives slavery reparations. Okay, good. And we receive repealing affirmative action, DEI, and then in the future, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And we also get really, really angry white people, which is, there's nothing more useful politically than a bunch of really, really angry white people that are pissed off in a vague sense about the government spending too much money. If there's nothing that politics in the last 40 years have taught me, it's that disorganized white people that are vaguely angry at the government spending money, those guys just get what they want all the time, right? Of course, lest you think this is a good idea, let's just kind of put this into context of what this actually means. Again, the reparations is not just like 40 acres and a mule. This is it's actually, I miswrote that. It's not 260, it's $280 billion a year. So I'm lowballing that. I just mistyped that. It's $280 billion a year for a century paid out directly to our enemy's activist coalition. In case you guys don't know this, in case this is a mystery of American politics, money that goes to the African American community in dollars always gets filtered back to the Democratic Party. Almost all services and things that serve the African American community pay taxes or license fees or cooperate with NGOs that directly work with the Democratic Party. Almost all of that money will be coming back to the Democratic Party in one way, shape, or form if it's paid out as an entitlement. $280 billion a year. Let's put this in context. An aircraft carrier costs about $18 billion a year. Let's put in $2 more billion to staff the thing to get it up to $30 billion. All right. So we are looking at approximately 9 aircraft carriers, nine fully staffed aircraft carriers deployed to the Democratic Party every fucking year. Every fucking year, they get 9 fully staffed aircraft carriers. Oh boy. Okay, great. And then on the opposite side, we have a law against DEI and affirmative action. Cool. I said to Otto, the government will never get rid of affirmative action. And I meant it. And he said, oh, wow, well, the government will never get rid of affirmative action. Don't you know? The government just did get rid of affirmative action and DEI. The Supreme Court decreed it. So it's possible. Is it? Otto, my state of California, got rid of affirmative action in 1994. But when they got rid of affirmative action, did they actually get rid of affirmative action? Of course, they didn't just get rid of affirmative action. There's more affirmative action now than there was in 1994 before they passed a law to get rid of affirmative action. And that's because not all laws passed by Congress are actually enforced if those laws go against the feelings of the unelected government that enforces them. That's why affirmative action has been banned for 30 years in California, and it's still more present in California than it's ever been. So, great. In exchange for the $280 billion a year, we get an illegalization of two things that are already illegal. So as opposed to having one law that is feudally telling a bureaucracy to do something that it will never do, we have two laws telling a bureaucracy something feudally that it will never do. Perfect. And then what else do we get? We get a promise. We get a promise to the American people that they will begin repealing the Civil Rights Amendment of 1964 slowly over time, a promise to in the future repeal a law. The Civil Rights Amendment is the most celebrated law in American history. There are a whole genre of movies that do nothing but celebrate the passage of the Civil Rights Amendment. Half of our monument and street names are to people who have passed the Civil Rights Law. There's a cult of Martin Luther King. It's built into our holidays. Support for civil rights is above 85%. Otto was freaking out because of the popular backlash that came from tearing down Roe v. Wade, which was what? 50-50 in the American people. That was a law that was highly, highly controversial. Opposition to it was in the 40s or 50s. Opposition to civil rights is in, if you're lucky, 4% of the American population. And 85% of the American population that's for it is not just for it, it's their fucking religion. They wake up in the morning and prostrate themselves towards the idea of civil rights. It's the reason they live their lives. It's the reason their lives have meaning. And a Congress is going to promise to repeal this law in the future after the side that would want to keep it is now just been handed fresh $280 billion of activist money every single year. Is this going to happen? No, it's not going to happen. No, and what do we get? We get really angry white people. Okay, great. I don't know what I'm going to do with really angry white people, because all of the white people that are angry enough, that are outrageable, have already been outraged. The only white people who are not outraged at the Democratic Party at this stage do not care about racial humiliation. They don't care. Either that or they're just so apathetic and unagentic and low IQ, as Mr. Otto likes to say, that they will never do shit. So I'm angering people who aren't, first of all, are they even going to get angry? Otto has this idea they're going to get angry at us spending trillions of dollars on slavery reparations. I'm not sold on that. Remember our laws of how normies think? Where our laws on how normies think are, they don't emote about things that aren't right in front of their face. So if they're not looking at the federal budget, they're not going to get angry at it. And really, if people got angry at the government wasting trillions, they would have already gotten angry at the fact that we're paying trillions of dollars at interest on the debt that we've taken out for the last 80 years. That's going to absolutely nothing. Nobody who isn't already angry is going to get angry at this. And there's not going to be any awakening of racial consciousness or religious consciousness or ethnic consciousness among white people because they don't know how. They haven't been given permission to think about themselves that way. Consciousness of this variety, of the variety that Otto is thinking about it in, does not come from outrage. It comes from education. If you're not educated by people you think of as high status to see yourself in a collective way, you will not see yourself in a collective way no matter how angry you get. So people can spend and humiliate, spend and humiliate, spend and humiliate as much as they want until those people are organized to think of themselves as something that has worth and pride and substance as a collective. See my previous ideas. They will not act in a concerted and organized way. Their rage will be random and cathartic and just lash out at whatever is in the vicinity of what's bothering them and never be directed against the actual thing that's causing them harm or be directed in an actual way to develop long-lasting political power. It will just be rage directed to the universe generally, because that's what weak, divided, individualistic people do when they get fucked over. They just rage against the universe because they've got no cohesion. They've got no agency. They've got no ability to act on the ground because they haven't built the power on the ground, because we're all atomized and they haven't been taught how to do that. compromise. No compromises made in the present do not bind future parties. Which party would you rather be in this fight? I don't know about you, but I would be the party that just got $280 billion paid to me every single year and has to only crusade to reinstall or to fight against the abolition of the most popular law of the last 100 years with an 85% popular rating next to it, with all of the media in my back pocket. I think that side is going to be the side that's going to win. I think that side is the side that's going to be part of that's going to be remembered as the side that won this particular compromise. But let's look at the converse of this. Through Otto's idea, what powers did he assume? He assumed that I had $280 billion a year for like 80 years, which is $22 trillion. I'm just doing this in my head, right? $22 trillion if you multiply 280 by 80 or something. $22 trillion over the course of almost a century. The ability to totally reform the American government under the proviso that we look like we're doing something that is reparations for black people. Now let's think. Can we somehow use these resources to leave us in a better state than the Democrats having those $2,200 trillion, than our enemies having $22 trillion and an unfulfillable promise to reform the American government? Can we beat that standard with a better idea, a better manifesto idea? Oh, I think we can. Okay, here's the Dave Green plan for reparations and helping. Do you want the fake Dave Green or the real Dave Green in this slot? Either way, this is my plan for ending white guilt / racial conflict, for establishing reparations. Since we have such an ungodly amount of money, and since we are trying to get rid of the Civil Rights Act, I don't really care. Let's just keep the Civil Rights Act. We'll keep it in place, but we'll just neuter it. We'll fire every single person that's involved. We'll buy out the Curtis Yarvin rage buyout, golden parachute every single employee of the federal government who has anything to do with the Equal Opportunities Commission or a DEI office. We buy them out, we retire them, they're gone from government, turn in their key card, go to some Cayman Island and have fun on a beach. We've got $280 billion a year, we can do that. A huge percentage of the federal government immediately goes down. A huge part of the bureaucracy of welfare immediately goes down. Our entitlements need to be immediately restaffed and reconfigured. Luckily for us, that reconfiguration was part of the powers assumed by Otto in his original idea. So it's totally part of our purview to use that power given to us to do something better with it. Okay, so here's what I would do. I'm going to create a new reparations department from scratch. And because the original promise was 40 acres and a mule, what the reparations is going to be is actually 40 acres. I'm going to create certain African-only zones of land that can only be purchased by African Americans and with free farm equipment, the equivalent of a mule, that will be then built on and distributed to African American communities for free in nice little African-only regions. If they want to. They can move there, they cannot, right? This is just for them, not for anyone else. And this is very, very easy. I don't need to actually make any changes because the federal government owns an enormous, ungodly amount of land in the center of this country. We can essentially just build new cities and we can give land away for the purposes of reparations. It is a land reformation deal. And lest anyone think that I'm trying to just backhand, create reservations for Africans, we're going to do this actually right. We're not going to screw people out. This is a pipe dream. This is so hypothetical. It's amazing. But this is what people ask me to do. So I'm doing it, right? This is going to be complemented with a targeted jobs program to replace the existing welfare state. So the government will use all of that money we were going to pay out for reparations to create jobs in the areas where it's giving away land. It will create jobs by creating industries there and then buying the product of the industry and selling them at prices that would be more than competitive with the products coming from China, reinvigorating our local industrial base. We're printing up $280 billion a year. That's well within our purview. Moreover, we're going to hook this into a general solution for all Americans by restructuring a new real estate bureaucracy that targets broad home ownership as the main way to redistribute money to ordinary people. And we're going to create new homes for all races of people, whites included, with total freedom of association, to be sold at cheap prices to keep the housing market low, and then unspool the real estate bubble that way. Essentially, we're going to unspool the real estate market by building these homes around our created industrial jobs and selling them to families who want to live there with total 100% freedom of association. And the reparations will be that if you're African American, you get one of these houses for free. If you're whites, you get to buy them for, or if you're white or another race, you get to buy it for a very, very low amount of money. One of our requirements is we have to give money to African Americans because that was one of the assumptions of this thought experiment. Then, with the remaining money, because we are selling money to whites and non-black races to recoup some of the cost of giving land away free to African Americans, we're going to use the remaining money to retrain an entirely new staff of government from high school. We're not going to take graduates from college. We're going to train a new class of bureaucrats from high school to staff our new land bank, land redistribution center. We're recreating the land back of distributist fame, and we're going to use the land back to redistribute land to the people in these intentional communities with jobs that we create to bring industry back to America. Boom. And it's going to be 100% staffed by another department that trains people to staff it right out of high school, and we're going to target people that ideologically agree with us. Therefore, we're going to retrain all of the $22 trillion and use it for our own new institutions. We're going to retool our entitlements from a cash-based entitlement to a land-based entitlement, and we're going to create a new government that's staffed by our guys while retiring all or as much as we can of the government of the old system. That is the Dave Green plan for reparations. Is it better than Otto's? I mean, it has us holding the $22 trillion. I like that. It's also a lot harder for the Democrats to come back at us after this compromise, since we've totally tore out their activist organizing apparatus in step number 1, and we've taken the money that goes to them and sent it to our guys for a new bureaucracy. Boom. All right, that's the end of the exercise. Okay, so let's look at our two plans next to each other and see which one is better for the right wing. The Otto plan: encourage promiscuity, have recourse for women in situationships that allows them to take money away from men, destigmatize the use of the word Karen for white women, praise enemy groups in the hopes that they reciprocate for some reason, end immigration, we share that one in common, pay our enemies trillions of dollars for promises that they'll do something in the future, make white people really, really angry, and denounce our longtime allies when there's a backlash so we can get more political capital in the short term. Fair enough. Let's compare this to the Dave Green plan. Let's, instead of encouraging promiscuity, let's discourage promiscuity. I think both men and women need to have a lot fewer lifetime sexual partners, women in particular, but let's do it across the board. It's not good for men either. We end porn by taxing it and pay gating it in exactly the way that I said. We end high-speed dating by taxing the number of matches you can have in the apps, destroying the Tinder business model, and destroying the OnlyFans business model explicitly. Instead of stigmatizing the use of Karen in the media, we culturally promote marriage and virtue in media by funding projects. We encourage allies groups to express themselves politically and to show strength even if we don't politically encourage them behind the scenes. We end mass migration. Again, the one thing that's common between the Green Plan and the Auto Plan. We retire half of the government, or at least a large chunk of it, whatever we can afford with the $280 billion a year that it exists as part of the thought experiment's assumption. We build an entirely new welfare apparatus based around distributing land and creating new intentional communities. And then we retrain allies to rule inside the new government apparatuses straight out of high school. You do not need a college degree. You have to come straight from high school and get only our certification. And we prioritize for young people who share our ideas. I don't know about you, but I think that my plan, using the same number of resources, is a lot better. If I do say so myself, the Green Plan looks a lot more sustainable than the Otto von Disney plan in this rundown of our mutual objectives. Okay. Now, people might be asking me, "Oh, Dave, this is such a good plan. Why did it take somebody to challenge you to write this out or to do a live stream on it?" Well, that's because, that's because this is entirely hypothetical. This is a thought experiment. I do not have the ability to do any of these things. I do not have $280 billion of government money. I don't have that ability at all to do this. So why would I talk about this at length other than to do it as a thought experiment? And to be quite honest, even though Otto von Disney is very happy with his plan, but actually doing something, let's say that he had never made his plan up, and I just came to him one day and said, my plan as a right-winger is to do just this. Discourage promiscuity, ban porn, promote marriage, encourage our allied ethnic groups' pride, end mass migration, retire half the government, build a new bureaucracy based on land distribution, and retrain the bureaucracy straight from high school to replace the old one we just retired. What if I just said that to him? What would he naturally say to me? Oh, Dave, that's too unrealistic. You couldn't possibly do that. Well, couldn't I? I don't know. You're right. I can't possibly do it. But somehow, his plan is perfectly workable. Even though, as the steps I did just demonstrates, I have not used anything here in my idea, in my plan, that he did not assume was one of his powers when executing his plan. Let's go back here. What do you notice about the difference between these two plans? They're both based around the same amount of power being used. Like, the assumptions of the power we wield is the same. I was very careful about that. What do you notice about my plan as opposed to Otto von Disney's plan? One, my plan is a lot more ambitious. It's a lot more ambitious. Second, my plan leaves us in a state where right-wingers actually rule the government, whereas Otto von Disney's project just essentially makes appeals to the normie imagination. He tries to placate public opinion as opposed to actually seizing control of the institutions. The Otto von Disney plan lacks imagination. It's selected to look realistic so that it can be appreciated as realistic. That it's not realistic. He doesn't have the power to do this. But the reason why Otto picked these policies is they look kind of like policies that we're already doing. For instance, it is very, very easy for us to imagine the Democrat Party taking $280 billion a year and spending it on their own client groups. I can imagine it right now. I can't imagine an anti-democratic coalition taking $280 billion a year and using it to partially disassemble the American government and build a new government. I can't imagine that. Well, why? Why? It's the same amount of power. It's the same question. It's the same prospect. How do we spend $280 billion? It assumes that you're in Congress ready to spend $280 billion a year. It's the same amount of money. But why in the auto plan does it go back to the Democratic Party, where everybody knows the right thing to do with it is to spend it on our own coalition to consolidate power and to destroy the apparatus of government that is hurting our society and build a new apparatus in its place? Why does that happen in the auto plan? Well, it happens in the auto plan so that the auto plan looks more like the kinds of laws that are passed in the present year. Because if they look like things that happen in the present year, then that has the cosmetics of looking realistic, even if it's the same amount of power being used in both cases. Yeah, I know I can say his username. I'm intentionally not saying his username because I didn't feel like it. Somebody will ultimately rule. Somebody will ultimately win the compromise. This is the fundamental law of democratic politics. The compromises in the New Deal were won by the people who supported the New Deal. The compromises in the lead up to the Civil War were won by the people who wanted to end slavery. The compromises over amnesty were won by the people who proposed amnesty, not by the people who wanted immigration enforcement. Somebody will rule. And the only people who will rule are the people who can imagine themselves ruling. Why in Otto's plan, why in Otto's manifesto does he assume all of these powers to totally restructure culture, to totally restructure government, to move around trillions of dollars in Congress? The assumed powers are massive, and yet with all of that assumed power, his imagination is still so small that the only thing he can imagine doing is giving all of that money and power in some way, shape, or form back to the Democratic Party. It's because we lack the imagination to rule. The point of this exercise, the point of all of these thought experiments, is to develop in the mind of the person the right attitudes towards power. And in this case, what we need to inculcate in our minds is if somebody has money going up, you take that money and you use it for your own coalition. You seize the power and you use it to do what's right for our people, for the human race, and for God. In reverse order of priority. You take the money and you use it for what's right. You don't sit around going, well, guess what? What a real politician would do is do what all the other politicians have done before me, but in a sort of kind of more smart way that looks like I'm playing four-dimensional chess. No. You take the money and you use it to rule and consolidate power. If you're not using the money to consolidate power, you're not actually ruling. If you're not actually taking the money and using it to incrementally push forward, you're not actually ruling. If you're hoping that you can create a catastrophe and then some kind of catastrophe will happen, a black swan will save you, the hurricane will hit your car and repair your car, you're not operating under ordinary laws of imponderability. If you're expecting that suddenly people will do things that they've never done before in the past, like getting angry at line items in a budget, you're not operating under the ordinary laws of probability. You are not executing responsible government. And that's because you do not have the belief in your mind to do so. That's the most important thing that we're doing right here when we're blogging, when we're talking about politics. Not to concoct phony, baloney, LARPy policy choices. This entire stream was a giant experiment. I could have been playing Dungeons and Dragons. This is about as real as Dungeons and Dragons, what I just gave you. Except for the fact that I hope that I demonstrated a better way to think about power and money. A few more lessons. Our good friend Lorgar Aurelian has showed up. Because there's one thing in this conversation about ruling that we just have not taken into consideration. And Mr. Lorgar has come to show us. Isn't there something that we're forgetting? What is the key to ruling in any kind of power system, but especially in a democracy? What are all political conflicts fundamentally about? All political conflicts are fundamentally about belief. Don't forget, this is a war of belief. After any policy is enacted, after any step forward is taken, the question is, what do people actually believe in their soul of souls? I don't mean superficial opinion polls where undecided people who were against abortion one day suddenly become for it because they heard mean things in the interwebs or on CNN. I mean what they actually believe in their soul of souls as a religious calling. What animates their life? What do they believe the way that Democrats believe in civil rights? What do they believe the way that liberals or progressives believe in John Lennon's Imagine? What do they believe in the way that everyone in the society believes in Dr. Martin Luther King? This is a war of belief, and belief will determine who's aligned and who rules. Obviously, although this was not part of the provisions of this thought experiment, the most important thing always is to control prestige media, education, arts, and entertainment. That's how you solidify normal behavior. That's how you solidify normal belief in the masses. And from belief comes permanent victory. Permanent victory is only permanent when your victory is instantiated in the mind of your opponents, when they say that you're right and that they were foolish to oppose you all along. It's an educational process. We obviously do not have the power to do this, but this is the goal of all political action. What's the point? What's the point? The proper use of politics in the modern world is to cultivate the right attitudes to wield power effectively, to imaginatively expand what's possible by showing what people could have while never losing sight of the practical trade-offs that are inside our own zones of control. Experiments in hypothetical policymaking are only useful to the extent that they accomplish it in this way. Our imagination of what could happen has to be a total conquest of the beliefs of our society. It has to be building in the minds, in the imaginations, in the hopes of the people that we're talking to, a better world that inspires them religiously to fight for it. That is the dream. That is what our goal ultimately has to be. And every practical policy either gets us closer to that goal or puts us further away. And the only thing that gets us closer to that goal is the organization of true believers in elite settings. And in my opinion, actually, all true believers are elites, which is why only true belief is powerful in this world. Mass politics aren't powerful. But the way you build this, and this is the second part of this statement, is to be aware of the practical trade-offs and goals inside our own reality. I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning. Remember this. Doing things, actually doing things, building your community locally, creating networks, going to conferences, joining new political parties, or maybe trying to infiltrate the ones that exist, although I don't think that's super effective. Politically lobbying, getting involved in local government, lobbying for local action, and doing all of this collectively. This is actually doing things. It is not the internet idea of doing things. Creating manifestos is the internet idea of doing things. And creating a political manifesto is as useful, if not less useful, than, I don't know, doing an exploration of Jacques Ellul or Gilles Deleuze or any theoretician, or just reading Hegel. You could read Hegel and it would be as effective as crafting hypothetical policy to be implemented like we did in this live stream. Those things in green are the actual things that do things in the real world, not building policy on the back of a manila envelope and then pretending like you're about to hand it off to Ron DeSantis or Trump in his first 100 days. And don't forget the lesson of the can opener. Hypotheticals can blind us. What killed the mathematician in the initial joke experiment? What killed the mathematician in the initial joke experiment was that he was so focused on the hypothetical can opener that he did not look at the practical problem right in front of his eyes. Certainly, it's important to think about what would happen if you had ideal circumstances before you, because it allows you to know what to work for ultimately. But if you sit around and talk about hypothetical can openers in a room that has no can openers, you're going to starve to death. So let's talk about hypotheticals to inspire and to give us new dreams and to reach for what's higher. But always remember, there is no can opener here. We haven't built the can opener yet. And talking about hypothetical can openers should not be our priority. With that, guys, thank you for joining me for the lecture portion. I will join you on the question for answers. The entropy link is in the description. Guys, welcome back. Okay, I guess I'm going to do the entropy chats now. So I don't use super chats, guys. I use entropy because, well, I made a promise that I would stop using Google super chats like years ago, and I never re-enabled it. It's just a better system. It helps support our friends who run that organization. And, creating networks where you use the technology of your friends is always better. And I haven't really noticed a drop off in the donations are perfectly fine for me to do this. I hope you guys enjoyed this kind of Fiddler's Green podcast 49.5. This was definitely not a usual one. I basically just did a policy rundown, contrasting it with another Substacker who were using the codename Otto von Disney, which if you invert the Otto von Bismarck Walt Disney conjunction, you probably could figure out the actual person this referred to. Anyway, let's get on to the super chats. I don't want to spend too long because I am going to fall asleep, having only 3 hours of sleep tonight. Dusty for $10 says, thanks, Dave. Well, thank you, Dusty, for $10. I appreciate it. Roland Silvio for $10 USA. How does one defeat the feeling that it is all a LARP, even for things giving positive, tangible results? Well, that's a good question. I would say, look, if it's giving tangible results, how is it a LARP? One of my favorite products that was made in the last 3 years was a collaboration between Aaron McIntyre and Poe the person. I guess she now goes by Poe's Law. She has a channel called Poe's Law, and this was a comic that they did together where Uh, this guy is going through the motions of getting fit, getting a job, going to school, getting married, and all the while his friends are saying LARP, 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 and then eventually you see him playing in the jungle gym with his kid who's pretending to be a knight, and the friends who are unmarried say LARP, but less confidently. And indeed, he is play acting with his kid, but he's teaching his kid the same virtues of we fake it till we make it. If something is giving tangible benefits in your real life right now, it's by definition not a LARP. This is something that I intend to write on a little bit more, and that is the idea of spiritual substance. I've got a lot of Substack essays that are kind of being gated currently, and I need to get on making the podcast episodes too. I'm like 10 behind on the podcast episodes. I'm so bad at that. But anyway, one thing I would say to you guys is you really, if you're feeling like everything is a LARP and futile, then you need to have some activity every night that is not screen based or heavily saturated in dopamine. Like, for instance, me and my wife are rereading Lord of the Rings. Every now and again, we read books together. I read to her. We read the book of Samuel and Kings a year back. And then we got really busy and I couldn't. And now I just do Lord of the Rings. And it's actually, it's almost, I mean, it's kind of blasphemous to say this, but it's almost a spiritual experience. The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's prose is so grounded that it makes you feel more substance just by reading it. And the feeling that you get in Tolkien's universe is that everything has supreme value to it and that life has a sense to it. And it's the exact opposite feeling you get from being online too long, where everything is just a reaction to something that's flying right at your face. And I think those experiences, both outside and inside in quiet moments, are kind of the key to finding that the feeling that what you're doing is actually meaningfully working towards an end and not just LARP. Okay, cool. Ben White for $3. Hello again, Dave. I recently attended a young adults cookout in a nearby parish. I tried talking to people, but everyone seemed to already have their own cliques. Only the deacon talked to me. He continues for another $5. A week later, I attended an event with the same group, but it was a rosary walk with a dinner afterwards. Although I'm introverted, I took initiative and led the rosary. I had a good talk with a couple of guys at dinner. How do I integrate myself? That's really easy. Well, this is not easy. What I mean to say is it's easy. What I mean to say is that it's easy to say in the abstract what is the good move and what is the bad move. My friend Charlemagne at the first Tennessee event, when people asked him just the question you're asking him right now, gave advice that I've used throughout my life, even though I didn't know I was following it. He said, the key to making friends is always invite other people to do things socially, and always say yes when they invite you to do things socially. So you had a good talk with a couple of guys at dinner. How do I integrate myself? Well, ask them what they're doing. And when they tell you what they're doing, just invite them to some similar activity that you might enjoy together. Or you can kind of put your signals out there and say something like, oh yeah, that sounds awesome. It would be great if we could do that sometime together. Just say that casually, throw that out there. And what's important is to kind of see each other again and again and again. This is one of the reasons why I like this channel Home Math so much, is because of his diagrams, because they're sort of perfect for our autistic age, because they explain ordinary social dynamics in diagram form. Even though I find some of the red pill ideas kind of obvious and cringe, it's really useful from that point of view to have this right in front of you. So when you think of social engagements, especially with women, think of it like an open door, right? What was it? So for instance, if you see a woman on the street, that is not, you do not have the right to approach her. If you see a woman in a social engagement, where it's implicitly assumed that you reach out and say hello, then you have a right to engage her and say hello and introduce herself. If she passes you a hint or an explicit expression that says she's not interested, then the door closes again until she reopens it. And as you might guess, the way you get to know women or anybody is to walk through a number of these open doors. So you're at a social event, you talk to a couple of guys. That's the first step. Then comes the floating ideas of what you guys both like together. That gives you ideas for something you might do in the future. Then, in order for this to become an actual relationship, you have to meet these same guys again and remind them of the things you talked about, and then walk through another open door. Either now that you have the relationship and you've established from the first time, unless you really hit it off, then you might be able to double dip and do it all in one go. But on the second meeting, you can actually propose something and be like, oh, hey man, I'm sorry we never were able to hike together. I guess it just didn't work out, but I'm going hiking. I was planning on going up to this hiking spot this weekend by myself. If you want to come along, I have a space in my car. So you see, now that you've gone through the first door, you can go through the second door. It's the same thing with men and women, except men are much more thicker skinned, and you don't need, where women, the door is always assumed to be closed unless it's opened. With men, you can engage right off the bat usually. And also they get creeped out less. So you can be more forthright in your engagement. But that's how all social engagements work. You propose things to do together and you say yes, or if you say no, you counter propose. And if you do that, you'll eventually have people you do things regularly with. The other thing you don't want to do is you don't want to meet a different person each time. You want to focus on 3 or 4 core people that you meet at every event, and you want to talk to them regularly. So you're doing things with them, you're encountering them every single time. The way a lot of modern people never develop friends is all of their social engagements are one-offs. So they never meet the same people again, and they never remember names. And so they're constantly walking through that first door again and again and again and again, and they never make any progress. You want to make sure that you have a regular enough schedule of activities so you're running into the same people, and so that you can progress and get to become better friends with them and keep on expanding your area of open activities. And for men, try to target men who are at your age, maybe a little bit older. And if you're going for women to date, usually you want to target a few years younger than you, but not too young. Or, I don't know, depending on where you are in your life is really, really, really kind of dictates that range. Autar Kumar for $15 USA. Is there a snappy definition of Gnosticism? I've seen it used to describe communists, fascists, queers, Lutherans. I always struggle to explain the thing on the spot or in a conversation. So Gnosticism, let me take a drink here. Gnosticism was a sect of late civilization stage religion that appeared in the Roman Empire in the 4th, 5th centuries. And, well, I think it might have been as early as the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. And these Gnostic sects had both polytheistic and monotheistic and Christian varieties to them. And the common thing about Gnosticism was it denied the world and said that the world was evil and that a perfect world was the ultimate goal, and that we had to overcome the unclean real world and kind of abstract ourselves. And the way we did this is by adopting the perfect knowledge. Now, Gnosticism has not been, properly, that religion has not been alive for 1,000 years. However, the Gnostic form of religion always comes about in the end of civilizations. Some people think that Christian civilization was actually 2 civilizations, one modern and one medieval. and that the Cathars were kind of like the Gnostic set of the late medieval civilization. And I think something might be similar happening here. But the pattern is always the same. And this is, so when people say communists or fascists or queer theory is Gnostic, what they mean is that it's a hyper idealized religion that idolizes sort of an eternally perfect self and denigrates the world and says that we should sort of get away from reality. Gnostics are famous for eschewing reproduction. That's a common feature of Gnostic cults, is they think bringing new life into the world is dirty and unclean and uncouth, and you can definitely see this in progressivism. They also think that the theoretical world can in some sense veto the real one. Now, okay, what are you thinking? Well, isn't all Christian like that? Like the kingdom of heaven, the world beyond, what Jesus talks about? Well, yes, but in a sense, all religions are kind of like that. All religions have ideals. But what contrasts Orthodox Christianity is very positive on the body and on life and on procreation. Obviously, some saints thought that, particularly St. Paul thought that celibacy in the service of a monastic vocation, although he didn't call it that, was preferable to marriage. Still, the mainstay of the Orthodox perspective on embodiedness and the world is that the world is good but corrupted, not entirely corruption, and therefore procreation in it is good and life-giving. And you see this in early medieval Christianity as an enthusiasm about interacting with the real world and being embodied in it. And the enthusiasm with the embodied world is a marker of a young or enthusiastic civilization. This is what Nietzscheans fundamentally do not understand about Christianity in its time, is they say, oh, well, Christianity was more abstracted and less vital than the pagan religions of the early Republican period. Well, I mean, kind of, because they're comparing Christianity of the 5th century in Rome's decline to the religion of paganism in its early civilizational spring. And so fall Christianity is more declined than spring paganism. But that's an improper comparison. To compare Christianity properly, you'd compare fall Christianity to fall paganism. And then when you do that, it's clear that Christianity was more enthusiastic and more positive on the body than its Gnostic pagan counterparts. And so the Nietzschean model misunderstands the history that it uses for describing what Christianity actually is. The Spenglerian model is much more accurate. So that's the common thread that people are tracing in all these different ideologies, autark. The Corbin Society for $5 USA. My proposal, let's stigmatize the idea of those with dual citizen holding political office. Bonus points, see who complains the loudest. Yeah, Corbin Society, I hate to say it, but my family is about to be all dual citizenship holders. This is in our immediate future. So I will be ineligible to hold political office. Not that I am seeking it at all, but I will be ineligible under this plan to hold political office because very likely in the future, my family will all be dual Canadian and American citizens. I hate to say it, but interesting concept. I mean, these are all, again, like this is as real as Dungeons and Dragons. If this helps you in your own lives understand what's going on in our world and what's going on dialectically, and allows you to align yourself in belief to fight for more vitality and more spiritual goodness in your life, that is helpful. And if it helps us organize politically in the real world more effectively, it is helpful. But these things are all hypothetical thought experiments. We cannot actually do this in the present world. And by the time we even conceivably could have power, the situation on the ground will have changed so much as to make these speculations more or less meaningless. Ben White for $5 USA. I've noticed the concept of walkable cities has been gaining popularity online. However, Kaiserbach noted walkable European cities have lower birth rates than American suburbs, despite having more opportunities for young people to meet. Thoughts? Yeah, I mean, cities have always had low. I mean, this is something that someone brought up. What was it? What if alt history brought this up? The person who I talked to, who this stream was addressing, Otto von Disney, also brought this up, and he's right about this at least. Cities have always had low birth rates. The way civilizations function with cities in a non-degenerate form is they cycle. Young people come into cities, they make their fortune, they go back to the country. Some of them stay and become genetic dead ends. A few more of them stay and don't become genetic dead ends, but then their children go back to the countryside to seek fortunes out there. There's a cycle. That's how it works. In order for a civilization to function, there needs to be an active city life that allows people to meet romantic partners and then go to a place where it's easier to raise families without just becoming giant IQ shredders, right? And there also needs to be an active country life to allow people to have children and to live in communities and to be the productive generators of the new human generation. That sounded redundant. but yeah, you need to be, literally you need to be able to walk and chew bubblegum. You need to have suburbs with close community life, and you need to have walkable cities. But I don't think that we're going to solve the city problem and have cities be places where we get above like 1.5 children per woman. That has very rarely happened in human history. The countries always rely on having a rural area to generate the majority of its new births. That's just how humans work. Michael Latorno for $3 USA. Did you see the Dawkins Heresy Alley debate? If so, do you feel vindicated? I really don't want to watch a debate between Dawkins and Heresy Alley. I can't imagine that would go. I do appreciate the fact that Ayaan Hirsi Ali's conversion now, after she's explained it, seems more genuine and less political. I think a lot of people were worried about her conversion being something of a political move to appeal to Christians, since she's now deeply affiliated with the conservative movement in America and therefore affiliated with Christians in America. But I don't know. I mean, Dawkins is past his intellectual prime already. He was never a very open-minded man. And so just hearing him ask the same set of stupid political questions over and over again, I can't think of anything more tiring than that. One of the people I mentioned on the stream was John Arcto, and we've had this back and forth about Christianity. I do intend to have him on at some stage, but the thing is that he has this really kind of Richard Dawkins attitude towards Christianity. And look, I mean, I have tons of friends who are atheists, more who are agnostics, but there's just, there has to be kind of this understanding of what good atheist arguments are and what good atheist arguments are not. And I hear a lot of arguments coming from John Arcto that are just bad atheist arguments. And when he makes them, I wonder if he's really understood the dynamics of the debate. And it's one thing to hear both sides of somebody like Bertrand Russell, and then a famous apologist like I don't know, a Fulton Sheen, just to pick a name out of a hat, right? And you listen to Bertrand Russell and you listen to Bishop Fulton Sheen, and you pick Bertrand Russell and become an atheist or something like that. Like, it's one thing to have the best arguments, and that's fine, but whenever I hear, somebody who's an intelligent person give an argument for his position that is just juvenile and stupid and requires him not knowing the response, then I'm like, okay, you need to, I think you might need to listen a little bit more, because there's something fundamental you're not understanding. Like for instance, I used to be an atheist back in the day, and one of, you always knew you had a solid slam dunk when someone would come up and argue you, and they'd say something like this. They'd say, well, evolution can't be real, because if evolution were real, why are there still monkeys? if humans evolved from monkeys, then why are there still monkeys? And you just look at them and you're thinking, well, you obviously don't understand. If you understood the arguments for evolution, you would not be making that dunk, because you would know that the response is obvious and your position is stupid. And sometimes with these very, very bright young men like John Arcto, he makes these arguments, and I'm thinking there's something fundamental about this debate you're not understanding. And I kind of blame this on Dawkins, who's a very, very intelligent man, but all of his anti-Christian positions were just, they weren't mature atheist ideas like Bertrand Russell. They were kind of like junior high school level kind of midwit takes. And I could never stand to listen to any debate or conversation he was in. Nerve AMV Maker for $5 USA. How would media literacy bros respond to William Blake's observation that Milton was of the devil's party and did not know it? Would he call Blake a chud for not realizing that Milton intended Satan to be the bad guy? Oh, man. This is so far above, like, the amount of real media literacy you would need to take on this question is beyond the capacity of any of the guys any of the brain dead leftists that complain about media literacy on Twitter or on YouTube. For people who don't know this reference, William Blake is one of my personal favorite poets. He wrote a bunch of poetic monographs. The best of which are the Songs of Innocence and Experience. And they're kind of like these little plates, these little very simple poems, and he had illustrations along with them. Like tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could craft that fateful symmetry or fearful symmetry. That's one of his famous ones. And he was also a famous religious heretic in the sense that he was experimenting with all of these new kind of, you could call them kind of Gnostic forms of Christianity, although I don't know if that was exactly it. And he famously did a variety of new takes on God and evil and hell and the work, the marriage of heaven and hell. You also might remember William Blake for creating that very, very famous painting of the end of the world, the most famous panel of it, which is the Red Dragon, which was used imagistically for the serial killer movie Red Dragon. And he's commenting that Milton made Satan look cool, which was kind of part of his worldview. Yeah, man, that's a very interesting take, Nerve AMV Maker. Obviously, Milton was a Puritan and believed Satan was evil. Probably Milton believed that Satan being cool and interesting was part of what made him evil. Under the Puritan understanding of Scripture. If it is interesting, then it must be bad, right? Because if it feels good, it must be bad. Nerve AMV Maker for $10 USA. A good project the dissident right could do is generate a history of historiographies. Historiographies. Knowing your history is good, but knowing the history of how your country's history has been interpreted is extremely insightful. Nerve AMV Maker, that is a delightfully Chestertonian conception. A history of historiographies. A club of queer trades. A paradox of paradoxes. Historiography is really obtuse, so making it accessible would be a benefit. That would be an amazing book to write. If I were a more knowledgeable person than I am right now, I would write that book, but I don't think I nearly have the breadth of reading to even begin to write that book. But that's an excellent, excellent idea. Augustine Bonhoeffer for $10 USA. During your podcast, Walt's advertisement of rakes like himself as protectors or reformers of damaged good women was laughable. Male promiscuity necessitates the depreciation of women's sexual market value. This is like a loan shark bragging about his business providing a leg up for the underclass. A loan shark is a good example, right? Because if you're a guy who's philandering, you are hurting the women because you're giving them a higher body count, which, like I said, a high body count hurts all people. It hurts men and it hurts women. but it hurts women faster. They catch the disease worse. They're like some races have a hard time holding their alcohol. Women have a very hard time holding their body counts. And in the modern day, men typically tend to be more sexually damaged by their experience with porn, which they perceive to be kind of a pseudo virtual body count, and which harms them in the same way. So I mean, by encouraging men to be laddish, if I interpret laddishness in the way that I think Mr. Otto von Disney or Walt is, it is essentially, yes, to increase the problem among women for other men down the line eventually. Like I said, this could work if it was only a few men at the very, very tip top and it was absolutely stigmatized and the abuse was kept absolutely private. But when this is just like all men can get onto Tinder and bang tons of chicks if they're in the top 10% of guys, this is totally out of control. And there's no way that you can build a healthy sexual marketplace on top of this reality. It is totally impossible. Michael Latorno for $3 USA. My uncle was a soldier in the Iraq War and told me his unit had a saying, "The enemy has just as much right to kill you as you do them." Do you consider this a reasonable view on current conflicts? Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, war never changes. War is war. And both sides fight in a war, and no side stands still. This is also one of the problems with pre-designing compromises, is your enemy, after you punch your enemy, they don't just stand still and go, "Oh, you punched me with your brilliant thing, your brilliant compromise." They unless you've completely crippled or destroyed them, they react. Now, I mean, leaving aside the question of just war theory, which is, I think, certainly not what your uncle meant by this, this is something to keep in mind when you're on the battlefield. So the reason why it's important to understand it helps you not develop an overly moralistic view of war. So, for instance, I say this all the time. My grandparents fought on the quote-unquote wrong side of World War II, or my grandfather. And my grandparents were, or my community, or not mine, but like my father and my great grandparents' community was, you could say, ethnically cleansed by the Red Army. But the Red Army is still heroic. All soldiers are heroic because even if I think that Stalin was the epitome of evil, and you could argue who's more evil, Hitler or Stalin, until the cows come home, that's not what the soldiers are experiencing in the front line. The soldiers are experiencing the decision to be brave for the man standing next to them and to put their life on the line for the greater good. That is what these soldiers are experiencing. That's the decisions that they're making. And that decision is heroic. So when you're fighting against the enemy and you're fighting in battle, you have to be aware that killing is something that you absolutely have to do. But I think it's really important to not hate your enemy in a cosmic sense. You have to hate them enough to kill them, but you can't hate them enough to hate their memory after they're dead. Because they're in the same situation that we are all in fighting these wars, even if the cause they're fighting for is 100% unjust. And for that reason, monuments to the soldiers of Stalin's army or Hitler's armies should be honored, just because they are soldiers, and we don't have to debate about who is worse. Augustine Bonhoeffer for $3 USA. Dave, what do you think of The Kid Who Reads would have been in a functioning society? What niche do you think The Kid Who Reads can fill now? P.S. Your family's magic streams are a guilty pleasure of mine. Yeah, I think we're going to do more of them because we don't have any babysitting. And so sometimes they're a way to spend quality time together. And, when we're trying to save, and babysitting is so expensive. Good Lord. Well, I mean, I did answer this in the stream called The Kid Who Reads. I did answer this. First of all, reading and literacy and cultural literacy is not supposed to be some purview of an elite section of your society. It's supposed to be something that everyone does. You're supposed to be reading books so you can share the contents of the books. I said I'm reading The Lord of the Rings to my wife, but people used to read books to each other together all the time. Reading is a collective experience. It's supposed to draw you in relationship with other people. And if books aren't bringing you together, then they're not really serving their purpose. So the first thing that the kid who reads should be doing in a healthy society is just being part of the general literate class of a society, and to use that literate knowledge for the enhancement of a collective community of which you're investing in for the long term, e.g. multi-generational long term, or AKA multi-generational long term. So, I give some examples, and the extreme example I think of is, this is a character that I remember from growing up in a university town, and that a lot of people remember growing up in other university towns, and that you hear about in the literature of university towns. It seemed like in every college town, at least, and I'm sure in some non-college towns, there were gentlemen who had jobs, but that wasn't their real occupation. Their real occupation was just to be, they were usually teachers, they were usually school teachers, but their real function in the community was just to be generally knowledgeable about everything. Sometimes in the South, they call them old timers, or local history buffs sounds very, very late 20th century, but you get the idea. And whereas everyone on the college campus was specialized, these kind of generally knowledgeable people would be there to kind of discuss random things with them and play chess in the courtyard and to hear about their research and listen and nod and then offer suggestions from other things. They're kind of people that brought everyone together. They're kind of like the VCs of the idea world before VCs became these insufferable technocrats. They're supposed to kind of be the connective tissue of the intellectual community. That's the role of readers in our society, not to lord over books or knowledge, but to share it with society and with people generally in the hopes that they can advance the community collectively, or advance all human communities collectively. Asteroidal Assassin for $5 USA. Dave, I have a confession. Twitter and modern politics have made me racist against whites. For one, Europe pretty much invented progressivism. And secondly, the European right-wing Twitter is absolutely awful. Do I just accept my fate? Well, I don't know. Is the European right-wing Twitter that bad? I know Martini and Brittany Sellner, and they're very, very nice people. I think I spoke to Laura Towler way back in the day, and she struck me as a very, very nice person too. So I don't know, man. I think everyone is at their worst on Twitter, and it's better just to know people personally. I guess you're right that Europe did invent progressivism. It is a Christian heresy. It is the medium for progressivism and not the cause of progressivism, but it is certainly a return of the Gnostic form of Christianity. It is the late civilizational stage of this current iteration of Christianity, just like Catharism was at the end of the medieval era of Christianity, and it needs to be replaced and destroyed. But I don't know, man. I think look, I'm not going to tell you not to be racist against other groups if you don't want to live next to them, because I think that's your right as an adult individual. But I think circumstances should allow you to say what's going on in Europe right now as part of a civilizational process. And riding the tiger doesn't always involve saving yourself away from coming up with sort of the harder consequences of civilizational decline. It's also to save yourself from unnecessary hatred, in the same way that the previous gentleman's veteran uncle stopped himself from hating enemy soldiers. Or to put it in colloquial late 20th century terms, hate the game, not the player. Hate the game, not the player, right? Pragmatic Culture for $5 USA. Lothrop Stoddard, on his trip in wartime mid-century Germany, described the ruling political party as lower middle class. Should their concerns have been dismissed just because of their class? It seems like a cop-out to avoid engaging in legitimate issues. Yes. Okay. So okay. And then I'll interpret it. Right. You mean mid-century Germany, like Mustache Man Germany, Austrian painter Germany. Okay, that Germany, right? Yeah, 100%. This is speaking as the children of lower middle class Germanic peoples who were not ever German citizens. Who lived during that time. My impression of reading about that regime and hearing about it from relatives, it was 100% a lower middle class party. And I mean, this is just one. I mean, I'm sorry, but like the failure of Nazism is a failure of democracy. This is the reason why democratic politics always suck. There's many reasons to hate Mustache Man, but all of his bad decisions are like these weird political obsessions. They're outcroppings of the Nazi Party's ambitions. And every time there's a conflict between what's good for the Reich and what's good for the Nazi Party or the mid-century German Party, Mustache Man always picks what's good for the Nazi Party. That's democratic politics. That's what sucks about it. And you're right, it's low class. It feels kind of dirty. It feels kind of LARPy a little bit too. There's none of the old aristocracy in that region. I mean, I don't know. There's a lot to be desired about the mid-century German experience. But that kind of lower middle class feeling is 100% accurate in my very subjective impression of an era that I never lived through. Concerns of the lower middle class should not be dismissed, noblesse oblige. The problem is that when the lower middle class becomes the ruling class, they do weird vindictive things like start wars they can't win and pretend they can conquer the world on a LARP, or at least conquer Eastern Europe on a LARP, and vindictively attack other ethnic groups that, you know, may have been enemies, but really, I think unhumane things were done towards them. These are the markers of low-class people that have come into too much power, just the way that low-class people come into contact with too much money. They blow it on things that are stupid. And I think that if the aristocracy had been more in charge, then a lot of those excesses and stupidities would have been completely avoided, and it would have ended up better for everyone. But that's my subjective opinion, pragmatic culture. The lower middle class should be served. They should not be the rulers because they do stupid shit. Like, just like the analogy to the lower middle class guy who wins the lottery is very apt. Hitler ran Germany the same way that your lower middle class person runs his fortune when he wins the lottery. Not intelligently. Ben White for $3 USA. Man, Dave is really laying out some facts against the tribe today. Dave, can you tell us, did the Groypers come after you told us about the brief flirtation with Judaism last week? No, the Groypers came after me last week because I said that they should stop attacking my friends like Aaron McIntyre and Pete Quinones. Nick Fuentes picks stupid fights with people. I mean, I don't want to be anyone's enemy, but just stop attacking my friends and people who've been longtime contributors to this scene, like Steve Saylor. Just have some respect for people who sacrificed for the cause you ostensibly promote, please. And by the way, I didn't lay down anything against Jewish people in this stream whatsoever. 100%. My only criticism is how obsequiously the Republican Party has prostrated themselves before Zionism and the Jewish community, despite the fact that both of those groups routinely act against their interests. Jewish people are fine, and they have a right to their own country just like anyone else. I don't think that gives them the right to violate ordinary rules of conduct that we have typically associated with war, and that God, I think, is associated with war. But that is not really a question pertinent to American politics, nor do I feel like I'm obliged to answer that. But I am very much obliged to answer how much I feel the modern conservative movement has rhetorically, I'm sorry to be profane, but rhetorically fellated this group and ignored their own principal attachment, namely to the core ethnicities of this country, of which I am not one, by the way. I am not a core American. I'm not a WASP. I'm not an African American. I'm not a Native American. My ancestors were not in the New World for very long. The oldest ancestor I have, to my knowledge, came in on Ellis Island in the 1870s. There might have been one that fought in the Civil War on the Union side. That's it. I am not a core part of this country. But if you're going to be, I don't know what to say that's not sexual, if you're going to be ingratiating yourself to this, to an ethnic group, and you are representative of the country, it's got to be one of the country's core ethnic groups. Otherwise, it's just a special interest. Julio for $15 USA. Hi, Dave. Any thoughts on AFPAC and Nick's latest shenanigans post-Twitter reinstatement? Dude, I hope AFPAC works. I heard he got kicked out of his venue. If you get kicked out of your venue and you have to refund people, you got to refund people. And it sounds like Nick is refunding people, so there's no issue. So that's fine. No harm, no foul. The only thing I want from the groupers is for them to not attack people on the right. It's really, really, really irritating. It's really, really irritating to have a mini ratio pop up on your feed, and all you said is, hey guys, you really shouldn't attack Steve Saylor and Aaron McIntyre. It's irritating, and it makes everyone associated with Nick Fuentes look like immature people who have no controls on their emotion. That's not a complaint, that's advice, okay? So guys, just act more mature. I know Nick's shtick is to pretend like he's really young, but dude, the guy's got to be in his mid-20s right now. He's no longer a teenager. So let's kind of get this movement on a more mature footing. There comes a point where you can't put just in front of your age anymore, and Nick is at that point. And the same thing is true for our friend Otto von Disney or whatever. This is, there comes a point where posing as the young guy is not going to cut it anymore. And Otto is as young as I was when I started my YouTube channel. So you can go back and watch my earliest videos, and you can go into a time machine and see me when I was just as young as Mr. Otto von Disney. And you can decide, if I acted in the same way, right? Some things are not about age. They're about a certain level of emotional maturity. And, we all go through those stages at different periods. But I need my political leaders that I'm giving money to be at a mature level. I don't want to give my money to people who act like teenagers. It's that simple. Dreadnought for $25 USA. Dave, it's been a while since I super chatted, but I want to support you. So here's this. Also, I took a year sub on your Substack. Oh, thank you so much. I took a year's sub to your Substack. I voted for more streams because I listened to them at work, but I swear you do another Corn Man debate, I'm going to freak. Also, please sometime post your pics of your Warhammer 40K models on X. Okay, I promise Sargon that. Maybe I can take a picture of them before I pack them up on the move. But I will try to do that. It's been ages since I've really gotten, all of my time now just goes into blogging and community organizing. That was kind of a COVID thing. and it goes without saying that I have no time to play that game. Not that I ever really did. It was just about painting things. It's fun to do things with your hands a little bit, right? But all my free time goes into doing the blogging. So thank you so much for the support, Dreadnought. It really means a lot to me. It helps me justify doing more of these crazy streams. And I do hope that this sort of mini episode was useful to people, even though it was on a subject that I don't typically consider very useful. Sam153 for $25 US. In any other time, your list would be taken as a no-brainer, Dave. Listen to the conversation with said individual, and it came off as more or less a cuck GOP groveling with even more mental gymnastics. Well, yeah, I mean, he's a good guy. You know, our friend is a really good guy. His early videos were amazing. The old Disney parodies were absolutely positively amazing. Seneca for USA $3. The lecture brings Isaiah 6 to mind for me. Sometimes we have to accept what we have no power on in the current moment, and the only way out is through, even if that is the way of pain and suffering. Well, yeah, I mean, true. I mean, look, John Arcto did an article today where he highly criticized this idea of the only way out is through. And I think that sounds very, very frustrating to a young man. And I appreciate that. But I mean, what do you want me to tell you will happen? Do you want me to tell you that we'll win the 2024 election and the American government will just fold instantly? That's not, there's not enough people to do that. In order for the American government to fold, the professional managerial class has to come along with that effort, or at least some significant proportion. And there's not enough defectors from the PMC class to accomplish that. Maybe there are in Europe. I've been told that there might be enough defectors in Europe, and maybe the revolution will begin in Europe and then filter backwards towards the United States. That would certainly be not historically unprecedented. So maybe this is a division between Europe and the Americas, and we need to completely replace the governments of Europe with right-wing governments such that people in America will realize that they're behind the times and make a similar change in that direction. So that's very, very possible, Seneca. Thank you. Black-pilled cat for $15 USA. Thank you for another incredible show. Greatly appreciated. What's the name of the intro song? The intro song is Cowboy Jig or Calliope House. And it's a fiddle tune that I bought from a independent fiddler on Fiverr. I don't know if she wants me to mention her Fiverr account because I deal with controversial subject matter on this podcast, and she might not want to be associated with that. I technically know this fiddle tune myself, but it's been years since I've played the fiddle, since my child was born, because I don't have very much time to practice it. And so I couldn't record it myself. So I had to pay someone else to do it. And still, even after paying hundreds of dollars for someone to get that stupid song, the YouTube AI algorithm still flags it as an IP violation, even though you can go on thesession.org, which is a site all fiddler players know, and see the sheet music in public domain. And I 100% own the rights to distribute that recording as part of my contract on Fiverr, and the AI still tags it as something that is not mine. So I don't know. Maybe we're a long way off from Roko's Basilisk. I'll just say that. But that is the song. Thank you very much. Dr. Thomas Raspberry for $5 USA. I disagree about theory. The application that works is downstream from good theory. Finding good theory can lead quickly to policies that work in action that attracts and helps determine right from wrong with these. Yes, I am a mathematician. Oh my God, you assumed the can opener, Dr. Thomas. You assumed the can opener. You did it. You became the meme. You assumed the can opener. This is great. Oh my God, the mathematician has spoken. Okay, look. Mathematics is about expanding the imagination to new things. I'm assuming the can opener is 100% a great idea to do in mathematics because it allows you to conceive of scenarios that are not right in front of your eyes. It expands your mind. It expands your imagination. But don't go telling me. I mean, we have to confuse. We have to disaggregate and distinguish between the imagination expanding thought experiment, which is what we just did during this live stream, and the actual political action. I mean, I could post my ideas up as a counter manifesto to the Substacker I posted against, but it's not actually a manifesto because it's not going to get implemented. It is pure abstract theory. There's also another way that I always talk about in which political theories are much more kind of like they're much more kind of like poetry. They embody a spiritual ethos that's going to bind you together and align you in belief and make you one people. But it's not something that has to do with logic and language and deduction. It has everything to do with feeling and camaraderie and catharsis and ethos and pathos. That's the real use of abstracted metapolitics. It's an organic substance. It's not some kind of mathematical formula of political physics, so to speak. Dreadnought for $25 USA. One of those things that I've come to realize is that the close to earth rule. The closer someone is to working with the soil and with nature, the more they understand reality instinctively, even without theory. I think that the leader we can follow will not be an intellectual, but a ruthless, slightly smarter than normal normie. Well, kind of. I mean, I think it might be a soldier, because who knows the earth better than the soldier, than the infantryman who's dug into it for his life. And that would be more in keeping with the tradition of Europe being led by its soldiers rather than it's hard to see farmers being leaders in this day and age, but maybe I'm wrong. Good super chat though, Dreadnought. Asteroidal Assassin for $3. I hope you're not upset by the previous super chat, but I got back from tabletop and there are these girls at my session who are attractive. How does one woo a liberal nerd feminist? Carefully. I don't know. I mean, there's two kinds of feminists. There are the kind of feminists who are going with the flow, and they're the kind of feminists who are true believers who've got chips on their shoulders. You will never get the second kind of feminists, and I just steer clear of them. Feminists who are going with the flow, you get them the same as you get any other woman. You act confident, you act masculine, you demonstrate value, and then after you are able to kind of attract them and pull them in, you increase your level of investment and the relationship progresses from that point on. Thank you, Asteroidal Assassin. Soul Gamut for USA $50. From a fellow Princetonian, thank you for showing by example how to stay sane and follow Christ in a blue state. I didn't go to school in Princeton. I just live here. Wow. Okay. Well, thank you very much. A local person. Maybe I've seen you at basket weaving. These podcasts are the highlight of my limited digital activity nowadays. God bless. Well, thank you very much, man. And that's a very generous super chat. I very much appreciate it. It helps keep me in business while I'm trying to move away from here. So I apologize, but I am moving away from the East Coast, at least for the time being. Asteroidal Assassin for $3 USA. Disney kind of reminds me of some of these Sunni Arab nationalists who hate Iran for somehow being pro-America, despite the fact that Iran resists America the most of any Middle Eastern group. Disney kind of you mean Auto? Oh, you mean Auto? I mean the actual company. Yeah, Auto or yes, yeah. Well, I don't know. I think that this individual is just he's looking for a niche to fill in the present moment, and the problem is that the present moment has gotten a lot more serious on the distant right. And so, back in 2016, you could just throw ideas out there and see what sticks to the wall. But people aren't thinking like that anymore. They want something that actually has some kind of long-term salience to it, so to speak. And for that reason, I think it's harder to find a niche here. So, I don't know. I hope that helps. Oh, pardon me, guys. Darth Calhoun for $3 USA. Great lecture. I believe that we swat down ideas that compromise with an explicitly evil political force is not our winning strategy. This is why I counter a lot of these ideas from my boomer family. I mean, compromise is part of how we wield political power from day to day. That's what we all do with the political power that we actually have. You compromise with your employer, you compromise with your family, you compromise with your church community. That's the cost of doing business. But A, they should be intelligent compromises based on the amount of power you have. And if they're timid and constrain your imagination, and hypothetical compromises shouldn't be timid and constrain your imagination. If you're assuming you have $280 billion and like you have that by assumption, and you give it to your opponents to spend to make it look more realistic, then I think you've defeated the purpose of your own thought experiment, which is to think about what you would do with $280 billion, not to tell a story about how you would give the $280 billion to someone who would more realistically have that $280 billion. There's this line from Lewis Black about, he played this video game about being a Britney Spears backup dancer. And he says, yes, sir. He's a comedian. He says, yes, sir. In this video game about being a Britney Spears backup dancer, the best thing you can do in the video game is to be a backup dancer. This is the perfect game for people who disappoint themselves even in their own fantasies. And that's exactly what I feel like in the Walt Bismarck manifesto. I mean, like you're dealing with trillions of dollars, and the best you can do is to purchase angry white people. I mean, it's given the amount of money that the fantasy gives you, it's just so disappointing. It's like me fantasizing about sleeping with Lizzo, right? I mean, come on. At least tempt me a little bit with the unrealistic. Novum for $10 USA. It's been a while, Dave. Moved to a new city and made many base people here. As a weaver, I have no one but you and your leaders in this space to thank for helping us bring us together. So as a grandfather used to hold his hat out to God at the dinner table before a feast and say much obliged for anything. Well, thank you very much, Novum. And always be weaving, guys. That is an actual thing you can do that increases our power. Make network connections with other people who believe similar things to you. Novum again, referring to an earlier super chat. Call me stupid, but I find the birth rates would improve in the U.S. with more walkable places for one reason, and one reason only to the U.S. Everyone would lose weight. Yeah. I find that, so what he says is, I find the idea that birth rates would improve from more walkable places believable for one reason and one reason unique to the U.S. Everyone would lose weight. If you could get people to walk around their areas more, people would lose weight and they would have more children. That is 100%. If we could address the health crisis head on, that would be amazing. Chai Squared for $20 USA. I need some basket weaving help. We're really consistent in meeting, but only to play GURPS, which is, I know GURPS. GURPS is Genuine Utility Role-Playing System. It's Generic Universal Role-Playing System. It's by Steve Jackson, the inventor of the Illuminatus game. Also a very good one, which is like Dungeons & Dragons, but more autistic. It's fun, but I feel stuck, like we aren't developing. Any advice? Yes. Okay, look. Basket weaving has to be aspirational. So by all means, play GURPS or do whatever you want to do for fun, but basket weaving always has to push you in the direction of what's higher. So do GURPS and then work on a political project. Do GURPS and then do a book group. Do GURPS and then do a classical music concert. Basket weaving always has to be taking people at a level and pushing them to a higher level, a higher aspiration, more political involvement, higher culture, higher class, better network connections. Furthermore, if you've got a really solid group together, you might want to consider the next step of turning it into something else like a networked society like they're doing with the Old Glory Club. Old Glory Club's not for everyone. You should check them out, read their stuff. There are other organizations that are looking to do similar things like the Beowulf Foundation, and I will be working with them more in the future. But always try to push higher. That's how these things work better. Joshua Nunn for $15 USA. Hi, Dave. I know this is quite old, but what are your opinions on Rufo versus Yarvin? And didn't you write a Substack essay some years back critiquing right-wing activists? It seems like there is always a friction between those trying to foster new elites and those trying to use conventional political methods. Well, I did write a Substack against right-wing populists back in the day, which I think was kind of sort of about Don the Pleb and his fight with Academic Agent. That was my first Substack post, as a matter of fact. I still stand by that. And activism needs to have an elite component to it. That's not me eschewing all activism. I think, for instance, the automated voting idea, like I've said this before, that just has to be the wave of the future. I don't see how we utilize organization without something like that to end politics and kind of bring the end of this mass political conversation that's really, really destructive and degenerate. And actually try to throw our weight around local communities. Yeah, I mean, there's always friction between those trying to foster new elites versus those using conventional political methods. Okay, so the Yarvin versus Rufo debate. It's old. So I made this tweet that Mr. Otto von Disney got angry at, where I said, because his response to my note on his article was very, very pejorative. And I found it irritating when I was putting together these slides, having to pick through all of these comments about how I was an old man every other sentence. It's like, Dave Green's old, Dave Green's old, Dave Green's old, again and again and again. It was really, really irritating. And he didn't like me complaining about too many pejoratives or whatever. But the brain kind of reset there a minute. The Rufo versus Yarvin debate was interesting. Rufo had some good points that you need to sort of push the envelope on activism, and that's fine. We need that. But the problem here is that Yarvin is right. Rufo's highest ambition, the pinnacle of his political activism, the thing that he's building towards, is to pass a law that says the exact same thing as a law that already exists on the books. That is not a proper endpoint political ambition. You need to be more ambitious than that. You need to be more ambitious than just repassing reaffirmations of non-discrimination principles. Just like you have to be more ambitious than, I'm going to repeal affirmative action at the federal level. It's already repealed at the federal level. It already was repealed in California for, what is it? It's 30 years now. It's 30 years it's been repealed in California. Good Lord. Most of my, the vast majority of my life, it's been repealed in California. There's still affirmative action in California. Are you kidding me? Look at the population of UC Berkeley. There is still affirmative action. Everyone can see it. You'd have to be blind not to see it. Yarvin is 100% correct that our ambitions are just too narrow. And you can't use realism to gate what your ultimate goal is going to be. And your ultimate goal is a mechanism for changing the actual ideas of the ruling class or installing a new, better ruling class. That's our ultimate ambition. And if our manifesto does not include an allusion to that in one way, shape, or form, it's not a very good manifesto, because it leaves the great questions undecided. And all it is a description about how you're going to cuck slightly less when you have power that, let's be honest, you'll never have. And we need to have better imaginations than that. Otherwise, we're never going to accomplish anything. Seneca, $3. Also, I noticed several Thomas Hart Benton paintings in your intro slideshow. Spring on the Missouri specifically. I appreciate seeing Benton as a Missourian. Yes. I like Thomas Hart Benton. He's one of my favorites. Regionalism, I believe, is his style. And I've always been a really big fan of regionalism as an American style. It seems to go part and parcel with the whole Southern Gothic thing. And I really enjoyed it. I never ever been to Missouri, but I hear it's nice. It's one of the, well, actually, I think I've driven through it a few times, but you know, as a coastal shitlib, it's never been really in my wheelhouse to know much about Missouri, other than to learn about it in history books with part of the Missouri Compromise. But thank you very much for the super chat, and I appreciate it. I think this is the last one for the night. Novum for $5 USA. I occasionally do voiceovers as a hobby. I'm no pro, but I like your Substacks enough to want to do one for at least one of them sometime. If I do one of yours, what would you like to hear as a demo? You need a tolerance for a Southern accent. Oh, well, I would love, thank you so much. Just DM me and we can set it up. Yeah, so one of my, Luke Avery from Lambda Bible Studies did a voiceover of The Data Made Us Do It. And I really, really liked it. So maybe I should solicit more of those. Thank you very much for offering, Novum. We should set something up. I'm really unorganized at this stage, and I need to get more organized. But thank you all so much for the support, guys. That's the end of the podcast. Oh, I'm almost done. But let's just read Psalm 14, and we'll call it a night. Thank you so much for the super chats, and I hope you enjoyed the show, even though it was very constrained. Psalm 14. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, their deeds are vile. There is no one who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on all mankind to see if there are any who understand and who seek God. All have turned away, all have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not one. Do all those evildoers know nothing? They devour my people as though eating bread. They never call to the Lord. But there they are, overwhelmed with dread, for God is present in the company of the righteous. You evildoers frustrate the plans of the poor, but the Lord is their refuge. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores his people, let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. Well, guys, thank you very much for joining me for this mini episode of Fiddler's Green podcast, number 49.5. And I will catch you at the next, I guess the Fiddler's Green podcast number 50. Have a blessed evening and a great rest of the week.